Welcome to Quiet Universe, where we venture into the quiet yet deafening echoes of history's most profound events. Tonight, we're stepping into a world forever changed in the early hours of April 26, 1986. A world where ambition collided with error, and silence was replaced by the hum of Geiger counters and the whispers of an invisible threat. This is the story of Chernobyl. Picture it, a small city named Pripyat, brimming with energy and hope, its skyline crowned by the mighty Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It was the pride of Soviet engineering, a marvel of progress, and a symbol of power. Until it wasn't. In a single night, this beacon of modernity became a specter of catastrophe, its reactor 4 erupting into chaos, releasing a radioactive nightmare into the skies. But what happened? What chain of decisions and flaws led to this disaster? Who bore the weight of responsibility? And how did the world react as news of the explosion slowly leaked past Soviet borders? We'll dive into these questions and more. From the flawed reactor design that planted the seeds of disaster to the haunting legacy that lingers in the exclusion zone today. From the lives forever altered in the shadow of the meltdown to the strange resilience of nature reclaiming the land abandoned by humanity. So, grab a warm drink, dim the lights, and let's unravel the story of Chernobyl. A story of hubris, courage, and the delicate balance between progress and peril. This is Quiet Universe, and tonight, we're venturing into the heart of a nuclear ghost story. The Chernobyl disaster was the result of a chilling confluence of human error, flawed design, and a system that prioritized production over safety. In April 1986, within the vast industrial complex of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, Reactor No. 4 became the epicenter of a tragedy that would forever change the understanding of nuclear power. The night shift crew, under pressure to complete a safety test that had already been delayed, found themselves navigating a series of critical missteps. This test aimed to determine if the reactor could be safely powered down while still supplying enough electricity to keep its cooling pumps operational in the event of a blackout. The workers were following a script, but the script itself was deeply flawed. The reactor design, an RBMK model, harbored a fatal weakness, a tendency to become unstable at low power. This vulnerability wasn't widely understood, even by the operators, who had been inadequately trained and ill-informed about the reactor's quirks. When they reduced the reactor's power output in preparation for the test, they unintentionally pushed it into a dangerous state of instability. Compounding this, crucial safety protocols were ignored or overridden under the assumption that the reactor was under control. A human factor loomed large: fatigue, a lack of comprehensive oversight, and a culture of compliance over questioning authority created a volatile environment. As the operators continued the test, the reactor spiraled into chaos. In mere seconds, a series of mechanical and human errors led to a runaway reaction. Steam built up in the reactor core, overpowering its cooling systems, and then the unthinkable happened. The reactor's lid, weighing thousands of tons, was violently blown off in a massive explosion. This was followed by a second, even more catastrophic blast that hurled radioactive materials into the atmosphere, scattering them far beyond the borders of Ukraine. What made the disaster so profoundly human was the immediate response. Inside the plant, workers who had no idea of the full scale of the catastrophe tried desperately to contain it. Firefighters arrived on the scene to battle the blaze, unaware that the smoke and debris they were breathing and carried lethal doses of radiation. Their courage was remarkable, but their ignorance of the invisible killer they faced was heartbreaking. In the nearby town of Pripyat, families went about their lives, oblivious to the danger. It was a day like any other, and children played under a clear blue sky that was silently poisoned with radioactive fallout. The systemic issues that led to Chernobyl were deeply rooted. The Soviet Union's culture of secrecy and denial exacerbated the disaster. Officials hesitated to acknowledge the extent of the damage, delaying evacuations and withholding critical information. For days, the world remained in the dark, while the radioactive plume spread across Europe. When the truth finally emerged, it shattered the illusion of safety that nuclear power had offered. Lives were lost, families uprooted, and entire landscapes rendered uninhabitable, not just because of the physical catastrophe, but because of human choices made in the shadow of ambition, ignorance, and fear. The Chernobyl disaster was not merely a failure of technology. It was a deeply human tragedy. The safety test conducted on Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant had a simple yet crucial purpose: to simulate a scenario where the plant lost external power and assess whether the reactor's turbines could generate enough residual energy to keep the cooling water pumps running until backup diesel generators activated. On paper, it was a routine procedure designed to address a potential vulnerability. But beneath the technical objective lay a deeper narrative of human ambition and oversight, a system stretched thin by the weight of its own demands. This test wasn't new. It had been attempted multiple times before, but had never yielded satisfactory results. Reactor 4, one of the Soviet Union's prized creations, was meant to be a symbol of progress and power, yet its design harbored hidden dangers that even the operators didn't fully understand. That night, the team responsible for the test was working under constraints and pressure. They weren't just engineers and technicians. They were ordinary people caught in the grind of a rigid system. Many of them were fatigued, following orders handed down from higher-ups who were more focused on completing objectives than addressing the deeper flaws in the process. The timing of the test itself had been dictated by bureaucratic delays, leading to it being conducted during the night shift, when the most experienced personnel were absent. Instructions for the test were clear in some ways, but dangerously ambiguous in others, leaving room for misinterpretation. The operators reduced the reactor's power output to initiate the test, but in doing so, they inadvertently triggered a state of instability. The RBMK reactor design was prone to instability at low power, a fact that was not well communicated to those responsible for managing it. This was not a failure of individual competence, but a systemic shortfall in training and communication. As they proceeded, the operators found themselves navigating an increasingly precarious situation. They disabled critical safety systems, not out of recklessness, but because they believed it was necessary to complete the test. They were following a script written with incomplete knowledge and blind trust in a design that was more flawed than anyone had fully admitted. The atmosphere in the control room must have been tense, filled with the quiet hum of machinery and the unspoken weight of responsibility. The test wasn't just about turbines and power. It was about the human struggle to balance ambition with caution, innovation with safety. It was a snapshot of a world where individuals were placed in impossible positions by a system that prioritized outcomes over understanding. The tragedy of the safety test lies in the gap between its purpose and its execution. A well-intentioned exercise that spiraled into a nightmare not because of a single failure, but because of a cascade of human and systemic oversights. Responsibility for the Chernobyl accident cannot be placed on a single individual or decision. It was the outcome of a complex web of systemic flaws, human misjudgment, and cultural shortcomings. At its core, the disaster was a shared tragedy born from the actions and inactions of many, woven into the very fabric of the Soviet Union's approach to technology, governance, and accountability. While individuals played specific roles that night, their decisions were shaped by a system that left little room for independent thought or dissent. The operators of Reactor 4 were at the center of the event, physically pressing the buttons and pulling the levers that led to the catastrophic explosion. Yet, they were not reckless villains but professionals working within a framework they believed was reliable. They followed procedures handed down from higher authorities, acting on instructions built on incomplete information. Their training, while technical, had significant gaps, especially in understanding the RBMK reactor's unique vulnerabilities. They were never fully informed of the reactor's tendency to become unstable at low power or the potential consequences of disabling key safety systems. On that fateful night, they made decisions under pressure, believing they were acting in the plant's best interest. The designers and engineers who created the RBMK reactor also bear significant responsibility. The reactor's design flaws, particularly the positive void coefficient that made it unstable under certain conditions, were known to some but hidden or minimized in official documentation. The Soviet system prioritized secrecy and prestige over transparency, meaning that critical design weaknesses were not openly addressed. The engineers who built these reactors worked under immense pressure to meet ambitious targets, often cutting corners or ignoring risks to align with state priorities. Above the engineers and operators were the plant managers and Soviet officials who fostered an environment where safety was often sacrificed for efficiency. The decision to conduct the safety test, despite its inherent risks and delays, was driven by bureaucratic pressure to meet deadlines and deliver results. In a culture that discouraged questioning authority, the possibility of halting the test or reevaluating procedures was virtually unthinkable. Managers prioritized compliance with state directives over the judgment of their workers, creating a top-down system where individuals felt compelled to push forward, even in the face of uncertainty. Finally, the Soviet government itself played an integral role in creating the conditions for the disaster. Decades of prioritizing industrial achievement over safety and an insistence on secrecy ensured that problems were often buried rather than solved. The culture of denial delayed the evacuation of Pripyat and hampered the initial response, compounding the human cost of the accident. Responsibility for Chernobyl lies not just in the actions of individuals that night, but in the collective failures of a system that placed ideology and ambition above caution and truth. It was a tragedy born from a failure to see the value of transparency, collaboration, and humanity in the face of technological power. The Soviet Union's initial response to the Chernobyl disaster was shaped by a mixture of denial, confusion, and the deeply ingrained culture of secrecy that permeated its governance. In the hours following the explosion, those in charge at the plant and within the Soviet bureaucracy were hesitant to acknowledge the scale of what had happened. The reactor's operators, many of them dazed and trying to comprehend the unprecedented chaos unfolding around them, initially downplayed the severity of the situation. It wasn't simply denial, but a desperate attempt to believe that the reactor could not have exploded, as such an event was considered impossible according to official doctrine. This mindset slowed critical decision-making when every moment mattered. As the radioactive plume spread silently over the surrounding areas, life continued as normal in the nearby city of Pripyat. People went to work, children attended school, and families strolled through the streets, blissfully unaware of the danger. The authorities delayed evacuations, fearful of causing panic and reluctant to admit the true scale of the accident. When the decision to evacuate was finally made, 36 hours after the explosion, it was presented as a temporary measure, with residents told they would return in a few days. This was a deliberate attempt to maintain control and prevent widespread fear, but it condemned thousands to needless exposure to deadly radiation during those critical early hours. Within the Soviet hierarchy, the disaster was not just a technical failure but a potential political embarrassment. Leaders scrambled to manage the narrative, keeping information tightly controlled. Local officials hesitated to report the full extent of the damage up the chain of command, while central authorities, faced with incomplete and often conflicting reports, sought to contain the situation quietly. It wasn't until radiation alarms began sounding in Sweden, over 1,000 kilometers away, that the world became aware something catastrophic had occurred. Even then, Soviet officials released only vague statements, acknowledging an incident but downplaying its seriousness. The emergency response teams, including firefighters, soldiers, and plant workers, were deployed with little understanding of the invisible enemy they were fighting. Many of these individuals acted with extraordinary bravery, rushing to contain the fires and secure the reactor site, often with no protective gear or knowledge of the lethal radiation they were absorbing. Their efforts were heroic but tragically uninformed, a testament to the human cost of the state's failure to prioritize transparency and safety. As the days passed, the Soviet government began mobilizing resources on a massive scale, sending in thousands of workers, or liquidators, to mitigate the disaster's effects. Helicopters dropped sand and boron onto the burning reactor, and engineers worked frantically to build containment structures. Despite these efforts, the state's reluctance to communicate openly with its own citizens and the international community cast a long shadow. The initial response to Chernobyl was not just about managing a nuclear accident, but about preserving an image of control in a system that was, in reality, deeply flawed and struggling to manage a crisis of unprecedented proportions. The international community learned about the Chernobyl explosion not through an official announcement from the Soviet Union, but from a quiet, ominous signal detected hundreds of miles away. On April 28, 1986, 2 days after the reactor had exploded, workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden noticed something strange. Radiation detectors, part of routine safety checks, were suddenly triggered. At first, they suspected a leak within their own facility. But as the plant systems were meticulously inspected and no fault was found, it became clear the radiation was coming from an external source, carried by winds across the Baltic Sea. The Swedes traced the radioactive particles back to the Soviet Union. Still, there was no word from Moscow. In a world divided by the Cold War, the lack of information was as telling as the radioactive evidence itself. Governments across Europe began to scramble for answers, monitoring radiation levels and attempting to piece together the truth. For ordinary people in countries like Poland, Germany, and Scandinavia, news of unexplained radiation clouds prompted confusion and fear. Parents were warned to keep their children indoors, and shelves were cleared of iodine tablets as a precaution against potential contamination. In the Soviet Union, the silence was deafening. The government hesitated to admit what had happened, driven by a deep-seated fear of exposing its vulnerabilities to the West. The culture of secrecy that had defined so much of Soviet life extended even to this disaster, as leaders tried to manage the crisis while concealing its scale. But radiation knows no borders, and the evidence of the catastrophe could not be hidden. Pressure from Sweden, backed by growing international concern, finally forced the Soviet Union to issue a brief, vague statement that same day, acknowledging an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The announcement, devoid of detail, raised more questions than it answered. The world learned about Chernobyl not from the people who lived it, but from the invisible trail left by its aftermath. It was an awakening for many, a moment when the dangers of nuclear power and the costs of secrecy became starkly evident. The discovery in Sweden was a testament to the interconnectedness of a world that the Cold War often sought to divide, and it marked the beginning of a global reckoning with the truth about what had occurred in a quiet corner of Ukraine. The RBMK reactor design used at Chernobyl was a product of its time and place, a blend of advanced ambition and dangerous compromises shaped by the priorities of the Soviet Union. On paper, it was a technological marvel, a reactor that could generate enormous amounts of electricity while also producing weapons-grade plutonium. But beneath its impressive capabilities lay a series of design flaws that turned it into a ticking time bomb, waiting for the right set of circumstances to unleash disaster. One of the most critical flaws was its positive void coefficient, a technical term with devastating implications. In simple terms, this meant that as steam bubbles formed in the reactor coolant, something that naturally happens when the reactor's power increases, the reactor became less stable and more reactive. Instead of dampening the nuclear reaction, as in many other reactor designs, the RBMK design actually amplified it. This was not just an engineering quirk but a fundamental danger, especially during low-power operations when the reactor was most prone to instability. The control rods, meant to regulate the reactor and shut it down in emergencies, were themselves flawed in a way that bordered on the surreal. The tips of these rods, which were the first to enter the reactor core during a shutdown, were made of graphite. Graphite initially increased the reaction before the rods could suppress it. In a reactor already spiraling out of control, this design choice acted as a deadly accelerant. During the fateful moments of the Chernobyl disaster, when operators activated the emergency shutdown system, the graphite tips exacerbated the situation, causing a massive power spike and leading to the catastrophic explosions. The reactor's physical structure also reflected compromises driven by cost and expedience. It lacked a robust containment building, a feature common in many Western reactor designs. This meant that when the explosion occurred, there was nothing to prevent radioactive materials from being released into the environment. This decision wasn't merely a technical oversight. It was a calculated trade-off that prioritized efficiency and economic savings over safety, a gamble that failed catastrophically. These flaws were compounded by a lack of transparency and a culture of secrecy. The RBMK's vulnerabilities were known to some engineers and scientists, but they were downplayed or ignored in official documents. Operators were not fully informed about the risks, and critical safety features were not implemented consistently across all reactors. The result was a system where those responsible for running the plant were effectively working blind, following protocols designed for a reactor that was far more dangerous than they were led to believe. The RBMK design, with all its flaws, symbolized both the technological ambition and the systemic failings of the Soviet era. It was a machine that embodied human ingenuity but also human fallibility, a reminder that even the most advanced technology can be undone by the choices and priorities of the people who create it. At Chernobyl, those choices turned a powerful reactor into the heart of one of history's greatest disasters. A nuclear reactor is a delicate symphony of physics and engineering designed to harness the immense energy stored within atoms. At its heart lies the reactor core, where nuclear fission takes place. Fission occurs when atoms of uranium-235, a fuel loaded into the reactor, are struck by neutrons, causing them to split into smaller atoms and release energy. This energy manifests as heat, which is transferred to water circulating through the reactor. The water heats up and generates steam, which drives turbines connected to generators, ultimately producing electricity. The process is carefully controlled by inserting or withdrawing control rods, which absorb neutrons to regulate the chain reaction, and by maintaining a steady flow of coolant to prevent overheating. It's a dance of precision, where even slight missteps can have serious consequences. At Chernobyl, this intricate balance was shattered on the night of April 26, 1986, during what was meant to be a routine safety test on Reactor 4. The goal of the test was to determine whether the reactor's turbines could generate enough electricity to power cooling pumps during a loss of external power. However, what unfolded was a cascade of errors that pushed the reactor beyond its limits. The operators reduced the reactor's power to dangerously low levels, a condition in which the RBMK reactor was particularly unstable. This instability was compounded by a critical design flaw: the reactor's positive void coefficient, which caused it to become more reactive as steam formed in the coolant. As the test progressed, operators made decisions that would prove disastrous. They disabled safety systems and continued despite the reactor's unstable state, following procedures that did not account for the unique risks of the RBMK design. When they finally attempted to shut down the reactor using the emergency system, the design flaw in the control rods, graphite tips that increased reactivity before absorbing neutrons, caused a sudden and massive spike in power. The reactor's core overheated, leading to a series of explosions that destroyed the reactor and released vast amounts of radioactive material into the environment. The tragedy at Chernobyl was not simply a failure of technology, but a failure of human understanding and communication. The operators were working with incomplete knowledge of the reactor's vulnerabilities, following protocols that did not fully account for its risks. The RBMK design itself, while innovative in some respects, was deeply flawed and lacked the safeguards present in other reactors. What went wrong at Chernobyl was the collision of human ambition, systemic oversight, and the unforgiving nature of nuclear power. A chain reaction of errors that mirrored the fission processes at the heart of the reactor itself, spiraling out of control and leaving devastation in its wake. When the reactor at Chernobyl exploded, it was as if the heart of a sun had been torn open, releasing a storm of radioactive isotopes into the air. These isotopes, products of the nuclear fission process, were normally contained within the reactor's core, where they could be safely managed. But with the destruction of Reactor 4, this invisible poison was unleashed, spreading across the land, water, and air, leaving a legacy that would haunt generations. One of the most immediately dangerous isotopes released was iodine-131. Iodine-131 has a short half-life of about 8 days, which means it decays quickly but releases significant radiation in the process. It's particularly harmful because the human thyroid gland readily absorbs iodine. In the aftermath of the disaster, children in nearby areas drank contaminated milk from cows that had grazed on radioactive grass, concentrating iodine-131 in their bodies and leading to a surge in thyroid cancers in the years that followed. The tragedy of iodine-131 was that its danger could have been mitigated with simple iodine tablets, but the delay in warnings and evacuations left people defenseless. Cesium-137 was another key isotope, and its impact was both widespread and long-lasting. With a half-life of about 30 years, cesium-137 persists in the environment, contaminating soil and water for decades. Unlike iodine-131, which posed a more immediate threat, cesium-137 is a slow-moving hazard, making vast areas of land uninhabitable. It seeps into food chains, affecting crops and animals, and its gamma radiation poses a significant risk to anyone exposed. Entire villages were abandoned because of cesium-137 contamination, and the land remains largely unusable even today. With a half-life of nearly 29 years, it mimics calcium and becomes incorporated into bones and teeth if ingested. This makes it particularly insidious, as it can linger in the human body for a long time, increasing the risk of bone cancer and leukemia. Strontium-90 added to the invisible toll of the disaster, creating health risks that were difficult to track and quantify but devastating for those affected. Plutonium isotopes, though released in smaller quantities, presented an even more menacing legacy due to their extraordinarily long half-lives. Though less immediately impactful than isotopes like iodine-131 or cesium-137, the presence of plutonium underscores the almost eternal consequences of the disaster, leaving a toxic fingerprint on the region that will endure far beyond any human lifespan. Each of these isotopes carried its own unique threat, but together they painted a picture of devastation that went beyond the visible destruction of the reactor. The radioactive cloud that escaped Chernobyl was not just a burst of energy. It was a mix of silent killers, each with its own way of infiltrating the world and human bodies. For the people who lived in the shadow of the reactor, these isotopes were not just abstract scientific terms. They were the agents of sickness, displacement, and fear, invisible yet inescapable reminders of the disaster. Radiation exposure affects living organisms in ways that are both immediate and insidious, disrupting the very fabric of life at the cellular level. When radiation penetrates the body, it carries energy capable of breaking chemical bonds within cells. This energy can strip electrons from atoms, creating ions that destabilize molecules, including DNA. For living beings, DNA is the blueprint of life, and when radiation damages it, the effects ripple through the body like cracks spreading across glass. In the short term, exposure to high levels of radiation can cause acute radiation sickness. For those near the epicenter of a disaster like Chernobyl, the effects were swift and devastating. Cells that divide rapidly, like those in the skin, bone marrow, digestive tract, and hair follicles, are particularly vulnerable. This is why symptoms of radiation sickness often include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, severe skin burns, and hair loss. For some, these symptoms appear within hours, signaling that their bodies are under assault at a microscopic level. The immune system, reliant on rapidly dividing cells in the bone marrow, begins to fail, leaving individuals defenseless against infections. For those exposed to extreme doses, the damage is so extensive that vital systems collapse entirely, leading to death within days or weeks. But radiation's impact doesn't stop with immediate exposure. At lower doses, or when the exposure is prolonged, the damage may not manifest for years, silently altering cells in ways that could lead to cancer. Radiation-induced cancer occurs when damaged DNA mutates in a way that causes cells to grow uncontrollably, forming tumors. Leukemia, thyroid cancer, and lung cancer are particularly common after radiation exposure, as the radiation's effects are felt most keenly in sensitive tissues or where radioactive particles tend to accumulate. Radiation doesn't just affect humans, it impacts all living organisms. Plants and animals in contaminated areas suffer from genetic mutations, reduced fertility, and increased mortality rates. In the exclusion zone around Chernobyl, researchers have observed mutations in plants and animals, from albinism in birds to deformed plant growth. While some species have shown remarkable resilience, the overall ecosystem bears the scars of radiation, with reduced biodiversity and altered population dynamics. One of radiation's most haunting aspects is its ability to affect future generations. In humans and animals alike, genetic damage from radiation can be passed down, potentially causing birth defects and hereditary diseases. This creates a legacy of harm that extends far beyond those directly exposed, altering the lives of those yet to be born. Radiation exposure, whether from a nuclear accident, medical treatment, or natural sources, is a stark reminder of the delicate balance that sustains life. At its core, the damage lies in radiation's power to interfere with life's most fundamental processes, turning the very energy that fuels stars into a force capable of unraveling living systems, molecule by molecule, over both moments and millennia. The radioactive fallout from Chernobyl seeped into the land, air, and water, leaving an imprint that stretches across generations. When the reactor exploded, it unleashed a cocktail of isotopes: cesium-137, strontium-90, and iodine-131. That contaminated the surrounding environment, turning fertile land into a radioactive wasteland. The immediate aftermath was visible in the lifeless forests, the charred, red forest, where pine trees turned an eerie rust color before they withered and died. Yet, the true impact of the fallout goes beyond what can be seen. It lies in the soil, the rivers, and even the DNA of the creatures that inhabit the area. For those who depended on the land for survival, the fallout was a sentence of uncertainty. Farmers abandoned fields that had fed generations, their soil now tainted with particles that would remain dangerous for centuries. Hunters and fishers in the region had to grapple with invisible dangers. The wildlife and fish, seemingly untouched, carried radiation in their bodies. Even now, decades later, the cesium in the soil continues to cycle through ecosystems, absorbed by plants, eaten by animals, and ultimately finding its way to humans. The contamination is a silent, persistent presence, its effects rippling outward in ways that are difficult to measure or predict. In the exclusion zone, nature has reclaimed much of what humans left behind. Deer, Wolves and wild horses roam the abandoned streets of Pripyat, and birds nest in the ruins of old apartment blocks. At first glance, it's easy to mistake this as a story of resilience, of life triumphing over disaster. But closer examination reveals the scars of radiation. Animals with shortened lifespans, genetic mutations, and reduced fertility. The balance of life has shifted, and while some species thrive in the absence of human interference, others struggle under the weight of the invisible poison that permeates their habitat. The rivers and lakes near Chernobyl remain another source of concern. Sediments at the bottom hold radioactive particles, a toxic reservoir that could be stirred up by natural events or human activity. Even small disturbances have the potential to release these particles back into the water, threatening ecosystems and communities far downstream. For those living near these waterways, the uncertainty is ever present. How much radiation is too much? How do you protect yourself from something you cannot see? Beyond the exclusion zone, the fallout spread across much of Europe, carried by winds and rain, leaving hotspots of contamination hundreds of miles away. Forests and farmlands in places like Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia continue to harbor radiation, making agriculture and forestry complicated and sometimes dangerous endeavors. Mushrooms, berries, and other wild foods often test above safe radiation levels, a troubling reminder that the fallout didn't respect borders or boundaries. Entire communities have had to adapt to living with this contamination, their lives shaped by choices they didn't make but must endure. The long-term environmental impact of Chernobyl isn't just about contamination. It's about the lingering uncertainty that comes with it. For those who live in affected areas, every decision, what to eat, where to work, whether to stay, carries an added weight. It's about the land they once trusted now being a source of danger, and the uneasy knowledge that the effects will outlast their lifetimes, stretching on for centuries. The fallout isn't just in the soil or the air. It's in the stories of those who call this land home, the changes they've had to make, and the futures that were irrevocably altered. Acute radiation syndrome, or ARS, begins its story the moment a person is exposed to an intense dose of ionizing radiation, often unexpectedly, in situations no one ever wants to imagine. The body, so intricately designed to protect and repair itself, finds its natural defenses overwhelmed in seconds. Initially, the effects might feel deceptively mild. A person might notice nausea or vomiting within minutes to hours after exposure, along with a strange wave of exhaustion. It feels like an abrupt illness, as though the body is trying to process something it doesn't quite understand. But this is only the beginning. Depending on the radiation dose, the initial symptoms may subside temporarily, offering a false sense of recovery. This quiet phase, called the latent period, can last for hours, days, or sometimes weeks. It's a cruel calm before the storm because, during this time, the damage is working its way through the cells. Radiation tears through DNA and wreaks havoc on rapidly dividing cells, particularly in the bone marrow, intestines, and skin. The body, no matter how resilient, starts to falter as the mechanisms that generate new blood cells, repair tissue, and fight infections begin to crumble. When the next phase arrives, it does so with intensity. High-dose exposure can trigger severe infections as the bone marrow fails to produce white blood cells. People may experience bleeding from minor injuries, or even spontaneously because platelets, essential for clotting, are depleted. Diarrhea, often bloody, and gastrointestinal distress set in as the lining of the gut erodes. Skin exposed to radiation may begin to blister, peel, or ulcerate, resembling severe burns. Fever spikes, the body unable to regulate itself, and fatigue deepens to a near-constant state. The progression can feel like a betrayal of one's own body. Hair, a subtle yet powerful part of one's identity, begins to fall out in clumps. It is heartbreaking, especially for loved ones watching, to see someone lose control over functions that are usually effortless, like thinking clearly or walking without help. Despite the severity, recovery is possible, depending on the dose and access to medical care. Some may stabilize after weeks of intensive treatment, their bodies gradually producing new blood cells and healing damaged tissues. But for those exposed to lethal doses, the decline is unrelenting. Organ failure, sepsis, and unstoppable internal bleeding can follow, leading to an outcome as devastating as it is unavoidable. ARS is not just a clinical condition. It's an experience that reshapes lives in profound ways. Survivors, should they recover, often carry physical and emotional scars. Long-term organ damage, persistent fatigue, or an increased risk of cancer. It's a reminder of how delicate the human body can be and how, even in such moments of vulnerability, the effort to heal and survive reflects something deeply human and profoundly brave. The Chernobyl disaster remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, not just for its environmental devastation, but for the human toll it took. When the reactor exploded on that fateful April night in 1986, it immediately claimed 2 lives. For those who responded in the hours that followed, the unseen enemy was everywhere. Firefighters and plant workers, unaware of the magnitude of the danger, rushed into the inferno, doing what they could to contain the chaos. For many, their heroic efforts became a death sentence. Acute radiation syndrome took hold quickly, and within weeks, 28 of these first responders succumbed to the devastating effects of exposure. Their bodies, unable to recover from the severe damage to their cells, gave out one by one, leaving behind families and communities grappling with sudden, incomprehensible loss. But the story of deaths caused by Chernobyl is not a simple tally. The tragedy didn't stop with those who died in the immediate aftermath. Thousands of others were affected in ways that were slower, insidious, and just as heartbreaking. Over the years, radiation exposure would claim more lives through cancers, especially thyroid cancer, which disproportionately affected children and teenagers who drank milk contaminated with radioactive iodine. The exact number of these long-term victims remains difficult to pinpoint. Estimates range widely, with some studies attributing tens of thousands of eventual deaths to the disaster's long shadow. Each statistic is more than a number. It represents a life altered, a family mourning, a ripple of grief spreading outward. For those living in the nearby towns and villages, the evacuation itself was a kind of death. Entire communities were uprooted, their homes abandoned, their lives forever changed. Though not all would die from radiation-induced illnesses, many succumbed to the despair of displacement, the loss of identity and stability. The psychological toll was immense, with suicides and substance abuse becoming part of the extended fallout. Chernobyl's death toll is not just about numbers. It is a mosaic of individual stories, of brave men and women who sacrificed themselves to prevent further catastrophe, of innocent lives lost to an invisible poison, and of survivors carrying scars that can't always be seen. It's a reminder of the human cost of mistakes, of hubris, and of the fragile balance between technology and nature. The legacy of Chernobyl is etched deeply into the bodies of those who lived through it, with illnesses that crept in slowly, sometimes years after the reactor's explosion. Thyroid cancer is one of the most well-documented consequences, particularly among children and adolescents exposed to radioactive iodine in the days following the disaster. Many of them had no idea that the simple act of drinking milk or eating fresh produce, things that should nourish life, would introduce a silent threat into their young bodies. The rates of this cancer soared in the affected regions, and while many have survived with timely treatment, the surgeries, scars, and lifelong medical follow-ups are burdens that no child should have to bear. Leukemia, a cancer of the blood and bone marrow, has also been linked to the fallout, especially among the cleanup workers who braved the radioactive zones to contain the disaster. For some, the exposure triggered a cascade of changes within their cells, leading to a diagnosis they never expected. These men, who had once been healthy and strong, found themselves facing an invisible enemy that turned their own blood against them. The irony is cruel. Heroes who stepped up to protect others often paid with their health and, in many cases, their lives. Beyond cancer, there's a long list of other health problems that have haunted those affected by Chernobyl. Heart disease and strokes have been reported at higher rates among those exposed to radiation, as the damage extends beyond just one organ or system. Immune disorders leave people vulnerable to infections they once would have shrugged off, and cataracts have stolen the vision of many who spent time in high radiation areas. Women who lived near the disaster zone often faced complications with pregnancy. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and birth defects became tragic realities. For the children born in the aftermath, some carry genetic damage, a cruel inheritance from an event they weren't even alive to witness. Mental health issues, though less visible, have been just as devastating. Anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder are widespread among survivors, especially those who were evacuated from their homes or witnessed loved ones suffer. The uncertainty, wondering whether every ache or symptom might be the first sign of something worse. cast a shadow over their lives. Chernobyl didn't just take away the present from many. It robbed them of the comfort of a safe future. Every diagnosis linked to Chernobyl is a reminder of the human cost of that disaster. Behind each case of cancer or chronic illness is a life forever altered, a family navigating fear and grief, and a community grappling with the weight of what it means to live in the aftermath of something so catastrophic. It's not just about disease. It's about resilience and the ways people continue to find strength even when their bodies have been made fragile by forces far beyond their control. The children born after Chernobyl carried the weight of a disaster they never witnessed, their lives shaped by something invisible but undeniably real. For many, the impact began before they even took their first breath, as their parents' bodies absorbed the radiation and passed on its consequences in ways no one could fully predict. Some were born with genetic mutations, tiny alterations in their DNA that might have gone unnoticed if not for the shadow of the reactor. These mutations sometimes led to birth defects, heart abnormalities, underdeveloped organs, or other conditions that turned their first days into a battle for survival. Parents, already grappling with the trauma of displacement and loss, faced the heartbreaking reality of seeing their newborns struggle with health challenges they couldn't have prevented. Thyroid problems became a recurring story among children exposed in utero or born shortly after the disaster. The radioactive iodine released during the explosion had saturated the environment, and even years later, its effects lingered. For some children, their thyroid glands became overactive or underactive, disrupting their growth, metabolism, and overall development. In the worst cases, it led to thyroid cancer, forcing young lives into a whirlwind of surgeries, treatments, and lifelong medical care. These were not isolated cases. They became part of the shared history of families from the affected regions, a constant reminder of how deeply the disaster reached into the future. Beyond the physical, the psychological burden on these children was immense. Many grew up in a world where their health was constantly monitored, where they were labeled as part of the Chernobyl generation. They lived with the knowledge that their bodies might betray them at any moment, that an illness could appear years later without warning. Others faced stigma, as people outside the affected areas sometimes viewed them with a mix of pity and fear, as though they carried the radiation in ways that could spread. Still, not all the effects were visible. Scientists have long debated whether the increased rates of leukemia and other cancers among these children can be directly tied to Chernobyl, or if they are part of a broader, more complex picture of radiation's long-term impact. What is certain is that for every statistic, there is a child who faced countless doctor visits, a parent who stayed awake at night worrying, a community grappling with how to support its youngest and most vulnerable. Even those who were born seemingly healthy carried the weight of uncertainty. They grew up hearing stories of the disaster, understanding that their lives were shaped by an event that had stolen so much from their families and neighbors. Some embraced a sense of resilience, determined to overcome the legacy they had inherited, while others struggled under the burden of fear and what-ifs. The children of Chernobyl, whether they bore physical scars or not, became living reminders of how deeply a tragedy can imprint itself on future generations, carrying with them both the fragility and the unyielding strength of human life. After the Chernobyl disaster, medical treatment for the affected populations became a story of urgency, improvisation, and long-term struggle. In the immediate aftermath, the focus was on the workers and first responders who had been exposed to the highest doses of radiation. Many of them were rushed to hospitals in Moscow, where doctors faced a medical crisis unlike anything they had seen before. The symptoms of acute radiation sickness, nausea, burns, and rapidly deteriorating immune systems, were brutal and relentless. Treatments were often experimental, as there was no established protocol for managing exposure at such a scale. Bone marrow transplants were attempted for some of the most critically affected, as the radiation had destroyed their ability to produce new blood cells, but these procedures had mixed success. Pain management and infection control became priorities, though for many, the damage was too extensive and their bodies simply couldn't recover. For the broader population, especially those living in nearby towns and villages, the medical response was far more fragmented. The evacuation of tens of thousands of people brought its own health challenges, as families were displaced into unfamiliar environments, often with limited access to healthcare. Many evacuees underwent basic health screenings, but these were often rushed and inconsistent. Children and pregnant women, who were particularly vulnerable, were monitored for signs of thyroid abnormalities, as radioactive iodine had already begun to infiltrate their bodies. In the years that followed, thyroid screenings and surgeries became common for children in affected areas, and some received iodine tablets to block further absorption of radioactive iodine, though not everyone was reached in time. As the years went on, the focus shifted to managing chronic illnesses that began to emerge. Cancer treatment became a cornerstone of medical care in affected regions, especially for thyroid cancer and leukemia. Specialized clinics were established to monitor and treat these conditions, though resources were often stretched thin. For many patients, accessing care meant traveling long distances or navigating a bureaucratic system that was ill-prepared for the scale of the disaster's aftermath. Mental health care, too, was critically needed but often overlooked. The trauma of the disaster and the stress of living with its long-term consequences led to widespread anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. For some, these psychological wounds went untreated for years, as the focus remained on visible, physical illnesses. The cleanup workers, or liquidators, who had been sent to decontaminate the area, faced their own unique challenges. Many of them were young men, often volunteers or conscripts, who worked under dangerous conditions with minimal protection. Their exposure to radiation was monitored, but not always accurately, and many were sent back home with little follow-up care. Over time, they began to experience a range of health problems, from cardiovascular diseases to immune disorders. Efforts were made to provide them with medical benefits and pensions, but these were often insufficient, and many liquidators felt forgotten by the system they had served. International aid played a significant role in addressing the medical needs of the affected populations. Organizations from around the world provided equipment, training, and funding for research into radiation's effects. Some countries hosted children from the affected areas, offering them respite and access to better healthcare. Despite these efforts, the scale of the disaster meant that many people slipped through the cracks, their illnesses going undiagnosed or untreated for years. Even today, the medical response to Chernobyl continues, as survivors and their descendants face ongoing health challenges. Clinics still monitor thyroid cancer cases, and researchers study the long-term effects of radiation on human health. For many, the treatment has been a mix of relief and frustration, of life-saving interventions and persistent struggles to access care. Behind every doctor's visit and every treatment is a story of resilience, of individuals and families trying to navigate a future shaped by a disaster that remains, even decades later, a deeply personal and painful reality. For the residents of Pripyat and the surrounding areas, the Chernobyl disaster wasn't just the loss of their homes. It was the sudden, irreversible shattering of their way of life. Pripyat was a young, vibrant city built for the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear plant and their families. It was a place of promise, where modern conveniences and a sense of community flourished. When the reactor exploded in the early hours of April 26, 1986, no one knew that everything familiar to them would be left behind within days. The evacuation order came swiftly, but without explanation. People packed what they could in a few hours, believing they would return in a matter of days. They left behind toys, photographs, pets, and the life they had built, unaware that they would never set foot in their homes again. The trauma of displacement hit hard. Families were scattered to distant towns and cities, thrust into unfamiliar environments where they were often treated with suspicion or pity. They became Chernobyl evacuees, a label that carried stigma and a constant reminder of the disaster. For many, it felt like they had lost not only their homes but also their identities. Pripyat, once a symbol of Soviet progress, became a ghost town, frozen in time and overrun by nature. For those who had lived there, the sight of their abandoned city, photographs of overgrown schools, empty streets, and crumbling buildings, was like staring at a wound that would never heal. The social bonds that had made life in Pripyat so vibrant were fractured by the evacuation. Neighbors who had shared birthdays, school events, and late-night conversations were scattered, and the sense of community that had defined the city was impossible to recreate. Children who had grown up playing together now faced new schools where they were outsiders. Parents, stripped of their jobs and homes, struggled to rebuild their lives while carrying the weight of uncertainty about their health and their children's futures. The older generation, particularly those from rural villages around the reactor, faced an even deeper loss. Their land, homes, and traditions tied to the soil were taken from them, and many felt they had lost their purpose and connection to the world. The cultural impact was profound as well. The disaster created a sense of disillusionment with the Soviet government, which had delayed information about the explosion and downplayed its severity. For many, trust in authority was eroded forever. The people of Pripyat and nearby villages became symbols of the human cost of bureaucratic failures and the dangers of unchecked ambition. Stories of their resilience and heartbreak began to circulate, turning the evacuees into reluctant witnesses to a tragedy the world was trying to understand. Despite the pain, the evacuees carried their memories with them. For some, these memories became a source of strength, a reminder of the close-knit community they had lost and the determination to preserve their history. Annual gatherings and memorials emerged, where former residents of Pripyat and surrounding areas would come together to share stories, honor those who had passed, and keep the spirit of their lost homes alive. The disaster's cultural legacy has grown over time, inspiring books, films, and art that capture the human side of what happened. For the people who lived through it, the Chernobyl disaster wasn't just an event, it was a dividing line in their lives. There was the time before, filled with laughter, routine, and hope, and the time after, marked by grief, uncertainty, and the constant reminder of what had been lost. It reshaped their identities, not by choice, but through a tragedy that remains etched into their memories and their sense of self. The evacuation of Pripyat and the surrounding areas began with a sense of quiet urgency, shrouded in uncertainty and confusion. On April 27, 1986, a full day after the explosion at Reactor 4, the residents of Pripyat were told to pack a few essentials and prepare to leave their homes temporarily. It was a warm spring day, and children played outside as buses began to arrive in long, orderly rows. Officials announced over loudspeakers that this was a precaution, assuring people they would return in a few days. Families hurriedly grabbed clothing, documents, and what they could carry, leaving behind furniture, heirlooms, and the small, personal items that made a house feel like home. Pets were left behind, tethered or wandering in the streets, as no one thought they'd be gone long enough to worry about them. The evacuation was a massive undertaking, with over 1,000 buses arriving to transport Pripyat's nearly 50,000 residents. The scene was surreal. People boarding buses with quiet resignation, many looking back at their homes for what they didn't yet realize would be the last time. The journey out of the city was marked by an eerie silence, broken only by the hum of engines. Families were taken to temporary accommodations in nearby towns and villages, where they crowded into schools, community centers, and the homes of strangers who tried to offer what comfort they could. As the scale of the disaster became clearer, the evacuation zone expanded, eventually encompassing a 30-kilometer radius around the reactor. This meant relocating tens of thousands of people from small villages and rural communities where families had lived for generations. For these villagers, the loss was even more profound. They weren't just leaving houses. They were leaving their land, their livestock, and a way of life tied to the soil. Elderly residents, in particular, struggled to understand why they had to abandon the only homes they had ever known. For them, the land wasn't just a place to live. It was part of their identity, their history, and their connection to their ancestors. Relocation efforts were hasty and often chaotic. Many evacuees were sent to unfamiliar regions without clear plans for housing or employment. Families were split up, some staying with relatives while others were assigned to overcrowded apartments in distant cities. The new settlements, hastily built to accommodate evacuees, often lacked basic infrastructure. People who had once lived in close-knit communities now found themselves isolated, struggling to adapt to urban environments or to rebuild their rural traditions in unfamiliar settings. The psychological toll of relocation was immense. For many, the trauma of leaving everything behind was compounded by a lack of information about what had happened and what the future held. Rumors about the danger of radiation spread quickly, fueling anxiety and mistrust. Some people refused to evacuate entirely, choosing instead to remain in their homes despite government orders, clinging to the life they knew even as the invisible threat of contamination surrounded them. Despite the chaos, there were moments of resilience and solidarity. Neighbors helped each other pack and offered rides to those without transportation. Volunteers worked tirelessly to distribute food, clothing, and medical care to the evacuees. Over time, many of the relocated families found ways to rebuild their lives, creating new communities and supporting each other through shared experiences of loss and adaptation. Yet, for most, the evacuation marked the beginning of a long journey of grief, displacement, and the struggle to reconcile with a future that looked nothing like the past they had been forced to leave behind. The Chernobyl disaster was a wake-up call that echoed across the globe, shaking the very foundation of how the world viewed nuclear energy. In the days and months after the explosion, as images of the shattered reactor and stories of radiation exposure spread, governments and industry leaders were forced to confront the terrifying reality of what could happen when things went wrong. Chernobyl wasn't just a catastrophe for the Soviet Union. It became a symbol of the risks that came with nuclear power, risks that no country could afford to ignore. For many nations, the disaster turned nuclear safety into a matter of urgency, not just an afterthought. The first changes came in the form of international cooperation, as countries recognized that nuclear accidents didn't respect borders. Radiation from Chernobyl had spread across Europe, showing that a disaster in one corner of the world could have consequences thousands of kilometers away. This led to the creation of agreements and organizations aimed at sharing information, improving communication, and establishing common safety standards. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, which had existed since the 1950s, gained a new sense of purpose, spearheading initiatives to prevent future accidents and ensure transparency in reporting and responding to nuclear incidents. The Convention on Nuclear Safety, adopted in the 1990s, became one of the direct results of Chernobyl, binding nations to uphold rigorous safety measures and submit their practices to peer review. At the national level, countries began to re-evaluate their nuclear programs. For some, like Germany and Italy, Chernobyl fueled widespread public opposition to nuclear energy, ultimately leading to decisions to phase out their reactors entirely. For others, the disaster wasn't the end of nuclear power, but it was a clear mandate to do better. Reactor designs were scrutinized, and many older models, especially those similar to the RBMK reactor at Chernobyl, were either decommissioned or upgraded with modern safety systems. Control rods, containment structures, and emergency cooling systems became the focus of intensive redesigns, ensuring that future reactors could handle the unexpected without spiraling into catastrophe. One of the most significant lessons from Chernobyl was the importance of a safety culture, an idea that went beyond technology and engineering. The disaster had exposed deep flaws in how the Soviet Union managed its nuclear program, from poor training and communication to a culture that discouraged questioning authority. Globally, this realization prompted a shift in how nuclear facilities were run. Operators were trained not just in technical skills, but in understanding the critical importance of communication, vigilance, and accountability. Independent regulatory bodies became the norm, ensuring that safety decisions weren't influenced by politics or profit. Chernobyl also left a profound impact on public opinion. For millions of people, it symbolized the uncontrollable danger of nuclear energy, and this perception reshaped the energy policies of many nations. Environmental groups gained momentum, using the disaster as a rallying point to advocate for renewable energy sources like wind and solar. Even in countries that continued to embrace nuclear power, the debate around its risks and benefits grew louder, influencing how governments approached energy planning and the transition to low-carbon alternatives. Yet, the influence of Chernobyl wasn't just about policy and technology. It was about the stories of the people who suffered and the recognition that their experiences could not be in vain. The disaster underscored the importance of transparency, of acknowledging risks, and of putting human lives above all else. In the years since, every discussion about nuclear power has carried the shadow of Chernobyl, a reminder of what can happen when safety fails and the devastating cost of getting it wrong. It became not just a lesson in nuclear energy, but a testament to the need for humility, responsibility, and constant vigilance in the face of complex technologies that hold the power to change lives forever. Chernobyl was more than just a technological disaster. It became a symbol of the cracks running through the foundation of the Soviet Union, exposing the deep flaws in its governance and its crumbling legitimacy. In the hours and days after the reactor exploded, the Soviet government's first instinct was secrecy. They tried to contain not the radiation but the information, shielding the truth even from their own citizens. While Pripyat's residents went about their lives unaware of the invisible danger engulfing them, the leadership in Moscow hesitated, reluctant to admit that something so catastrophic had occurred, when the truth could no longer be hidden. When radiation alarms sounded in Sweden and winds carried the fallout across Europe, the Soviet Union was forced into the global spotlight, its veil of control and competence ripped away. For ordinary citizens, the disaster revealed what many had long suspected, but perhaps hadn't dared to fully acknowledge. The state was not infallible, and its leaders were not protecting them. The delayed evacuation of Pripyat, the lack of clear communication, and the initial dismissal of health risks bred anger and mistrust. Families who had once believed in the promise of Soviet progress now questioned the very system that had exposed them and their children to such unimaginable harm. The realization that their lives and safety had been sacrificed on the altar of political expediency shattered the social contract that had held the Soviet Union together, even in its most difficult times. Chernobyl also placed immense strain on the Soviet economy, which was already teetering under the weight of mismanagement and stagnation. The cleanup operation, the construction of the sarcophagus over the reactor, the relocation and compensation of hundreds of thousands of evacuees. These efforts drained resources at a time when the state could barely afford to meet its people's basic needs. Entire villages were abandoned, farmland rendered useless, and industries disrupted, creating a ripple effect of economic loss that deepened the Union's existing vulnerabilities. The disaster wasn't just a single event. It became an ongoing crisis that bled into every aspect of Soviet life, highlighting the system's inability to recover quickly or efficiently. Politically, Chernobyl accelerated a shift that was already underway. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader at the time, had been championing glasnost, a policy of openness and transparency. But Chernobyl forced glasnost into overdrive, making it impossible for the government to continue operating with the same secrecy and control that had defined the Soviet era. As more information about the scale of the disaster emerged, people began to speak out, not just about Chernobyl but about corruption, environmental neglect, and the failures of the state. The disaster became a catalyst for broader criticism, empowering voices that had been suppressed for decades. The fallout wasn't just physical or economic. It was deeply psychological. Chernobyl eroded the sense of unity and purpose that had held the Soviet Union together, even through hardship. For Ukrainians, in particular, the disaster became a defining moment, fueling nationalist sentiments and a growing desire for independence. The poisoned lands around Chernobyl were not just a tragedy. They were a stark reminder of Moscow's disregard for local lives and the environment. This resentment, combined with the broader unraveling of Soviet authority, played a key role in Ukraine's push for sovereignty and the eventual dissolution of the Union. Chernobyl didn't single-handedly bring down the Soviet Union, but it laid bare the systemic rot that made its collapse inevitable. It was a disaster that transcended borders, both geographic and ideological, exposing a state that could no longer control its narrative, its people, or its destiny. For many, the reactor's explosion wasn't just the end of a city or a way of life. It was the beginning of the end of an empire. Chernobyl has left a profound imprint on literature, film, and television, as creators across the world have grappled with the enormity of the disaster and its aftermath. Each depiction carries its own lens, whether focusing on the human cost, the environmental devastation, or the political implications. At its heart, these stories attempt to make sense of an event that was almost incomprehensible in its scale and horror. They capture the lives of those who were there, the workers, the residents, the soldiers, and the scientists, while also delving into the broader implications for humanity as a whole. Books have often provided the most intimate portrayals, delving into the voices of those who lived through the disaster. Svetlana Alexievica's Voices from Chernobyl, for example, is a haunting oral history that pieces together the testimonies of survivors, first responders, and evacuees. It doesn't shy away from the raw pain of their experiences. The soldier who dug trenches in radioactive soil, the mother who lost her child to radiation sickness, the farmer who refused to leave the land of his ancestors. Through their words, the abstract becomes deeply personal, and the invisible threat of radiation takes on a visceral, human form. The book doesn't offer neat conclusions or answers. Instead, it allows readers to sit with the complexity of grief, love, and survival in the wake of catastrophe. In film, the disaster has been both a backdrop and a central subject, often framed as a cautionary tale about humanity's hubris. Movies like The Battle of Chernobyl document the heroism and chaos of the immediate response, highlighting the bravery of those who risked, and often lost, their lives to contain the fallout. Other films have taken a more fictionalized approach, weaving Chernobyl into horror or thriller narratives. While these works sometimes stray into sensationalism, they unearth the lingering fear and fascination the disaster inspires. The desolate exclusion zone, with its abandoned buildings and eerie silence, has become a powerful visual metaphor for the fragility of human civilization. Television has perhaps done the most to bring Chernobyl into the public consciousness in recent years, with HBO's Chernobyl series standing out as a landmark depiction. The series doesn't just recreate the events of April 1986. It explores the systemic failures, the courage of individuals, and the devastating consequences of lies and secrecy. It portrays the disaster as both a technical failure and a human tragedy, focusing on figures like Valery Legasov, the scientist who fought to reveal the truth, and Lyudmila Ignatenko, a firefighter's wife who watched her husband succumb to radiation poisoning. The series is meticulous in its detail, from the crumbling reactor to the grim hospital wards, but it also finds space for quiet moments of humanity. A nurse comforting a dying patient, a miner's grim determination as he digs beneath the reactor. It resonated deeply with audiences, sparking renewed interest in Chernobyl's history and its lessons for the present. Chernobyl's depictions are not confined to a single genre or medium. They range from stark documentaries to poetic novels, from blockbuster thrillers to quiet, reflective essays. What unites them is a sense of grappling with the enormity of what happened, the scale of the suffering, and the questions it raises about power, responsibility, and the limits of human knowledge. These works don't just tell the story of a nuclear disaster. They remind us of the people who lived, and sometimes died, in its shadow. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the cost of progress and the ways in which societies respond to crisis. The Chernobyl exclusion zone is a haunting testament to the fragility of human ambition when it collides with the forces of nature. Spanning approximately 2,600 square kilometers across Ukraine and extending into parts of Belarus, this area stands as both a warning and a symbol of resilience. In 1986, the catastrophic explosion of Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant released an immense cloud of radioactive materials, forcing thousands of people to abandon their homes overnight. Entire towns, once brimming with life, became ghostly relics of a past frozen in time, where echoes of laughter and daily routines were silenced in a single, dreadful moment. Walking through this zone today feels surreal. The town of Pripyat, built to house plant workers and their families, is a chilling reminder of human vulnerability. Schools with desks still lined up, children's toys scattered in the dust, and propaganda posters plastered on walls now crumbling with age speak of lives interrupted. It's not just an empty place. It's a monument to those who lived, loved, and dreamed there, now overtaken by nature's unrelenting will to reclaim the land. Radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 and strontium-90 remain embedded in the soil and water, making large parts of the zone uninhabitable even decades later. The initial explosion decimated wildlife, but in the years since, something extraordinary has happened. Without human interference, nature has begun to thrive. Wild boars roam the streets of abandoned villages, packs of wolves patrol the forests, and rare species like the Przewalski's horse find sanctuary in this unintended reserve. It's as if the absence of humans allowed ecosystems to recalibrate in ways that both fascinate and unsettle scientists. Yet, it's not a paradise. The vegetation absorbs radiation, passing it along the food chain. Animals often live shorter lives, and their populations are studied intensively for mutations and health anomalies. The zone's rivers and streams still carry contamination, impacting areas far beyond the immediate vicinity. Despite this, the contrast between destruction and renewal gives the area an almost poetic duality, an eerie beauty wrapped in tragedy. Human curiosity keeps the zone alive in another way. Researchers, thrill seekers, and even former residents return, drawn by the invisible ties to a place they once called home or seek to understand. Workers in the zone, many of whom shuttle in daily, speak of a strange, almost spiritual connection to this land, despite the dangers. For them, the exclusion zone is not just a job but a poignant reminder of what was lost and what could be again. Chernobyl's exclusion zone stands as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both innovation and error. It is a place where time feels distorted, where the past collides with the present, and where life, both human and non-human, endures against all odds. It asks hard questions about our relationship with technology, nature, and the consequences of pushing too far without understanding the risks. In the eerie silence of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, life has taken on a form that defies expectations. After the nuclear disaster rendered the area uninhabitable for humans, wildlife moved in, not out of choice but as a consequence of circumstance. Over the decades, these animals have adapted to the lingering radiation, weaving a complex narrative of survival that feels both miraculous and unsettling. It's a story of creatures learning to exist in a world fundamentally altered, where every breath, bite, and movement carries the shadow of invisible danger. The wolves, for example, are now the apex predators of this strange ecosystem, roaming freely through forests that have overtaken abandoned towns. Their numbers have surged, thriving in the absence of human activity. Yet, these wolves are not untouched by radiation. Studies reveal that they travel far beyond the exclusion zone, raising concerns about the potential spread of radiation-linked genetic mutations. Still, they hunt, mate, and rear their young, embodying a resilience that seems almost defiant. Other species, like the resilient Przewalski's horses, tell a similar story. Once teetering on the brink of extinction, these wild horses now roam freely within the zone, grazing on grasses that contain trace amounts of radiation. Their survival is a paradox. While they've found sanctuary in this human-free zone, their exposure to contamination makes their long-term health uncertain. The birds that nest in the cracked walls of abandoned buildings exhibit abnormalities too. Many have smaller brains or altered feather pigmentation. Yet, generation after generation, they continue to live, adapt, and sing, as if unaware of the invisible threat surrounding them. Even the plants tell a tale of adaptation. Pine trees grow in twisted, gnarled shapes, their DNA altered by radiation. Mushrooms absorb radioactive isotopes from the soil, quietly spreading the contamination through the food web. But alongside these changes, the sheer persistence of life is staggering. Wildflowers bloom, forests regenerate, and wetlands flourish in areas where radiation levels remain high, creating an unexpected oasis of biodiversity. For humans who venture into the zone, scientists, workers, and even the occasional illegal forager, there's a sense of uneasy wonder. These animals and plants are not thriving in the conventional sense. They are surviving in a compromised world, adapting in ways that speak to the tenacity of life itself. Researchers carefully collect samples, observing the interplay between radiation and biology, hoping to understand the long-term consequences of such exposure. What they find is a fragile balance, a community of organisms navigating an environment that humanity inadvertently reshaped. The wildlife in the Chernobyl exclusion zone is a living experiment, one without a control group, where nature rewrites its rules in real time. For those who watch from the edges of this altered world, there's a mixture of awe and guilt. The animals did not choose this, they inherited it, adapting to a legacy they neither created nor can escape. In their resilience, there's both a warning and a reminder. Life endures, but at a cost we are only beginning to comprehend. The question of whether humans can safely live in areas affected by the Chernobyl disaster today is as much about science as it is about memory, fear, and resilience. Decades after the explosion, the land remains a patchwork of possibilities and perils. In some areas, radiation levels have diminished significantly, especially where the initial fallout settled unevenly. Other places, like the Red Forest, still hum with danger, the soil and trees saturated with radioactive isotopes that will take centuries to decay. It's a landscape divided not by fences but by an invisible threat, making the prospect of returning a deeply personal and complicated decision. For a handful of people, safety is a relative concept. Some of the so-called self-settlers, mostly elderly villagers, chose to return to their homes in the exclusion zone despite warnings. To them, the risks of radiation paled compared to the grief of losing their land and the life they'd known. These individuals grow their own food, drink water from local wells, and live out their days in a quiet, radioactive solitude. Many claim to feel healthy, attributing their longevity to the peace of their surroundings and the familiarity of home, though scientific data suggests they live under a constant, low-level risk of exposure. For others, particularly scientists and zone workers, safety is managed through strict protocols. They work in shifts, limiting their time in higher radiation zones to minimize exposure. Their stories reveal the strange coexistence of routine and danger. A construction worker building the new sarcophagus around Reactor 4 might describe the meticulous safety measures, the badges that measure radiation doses, the layers of protective clothing, but also the unspoken understanding that the job carries risks few would willingly accept. Efforts to decontaminate some areas have met with partial success. Towns like Pripyat, where radiation levels remain dangerously high, are far from habitable. But further from the epicenter, some areas are showing signs of recovery. Radiation in these places has fallen to levels comparable to naturally occurring background radiation in some parts of the world. Even if the science says the land is safe, the psychological weight of living in a place marked by such a disaster is another hurdle entirely. For those who might consider returning or resettling nearby, the decision is shadowed by uncertainty. Long-term studies of the health impacts of low-level radiation exposure are inconclusive, and the risk varies greatly depending on specific locations. A patch of farmland may be safe, while a nearby forest could still harbor dangerous levels of radioactive particles in its soil and leaf litter. The unpredictability makes safe a hard term to define. Ultimately, the land around Chernobyl is no longer just a physical space. It is a symbol, a scar, and a question mark. Can people live there? Some already do, out of necessity, defiance, or love for their home. But whether they can truly thrive, there is a question science continues to explore, and one that speaks to the broader human struggle to reconcile with our past mistakes while imagining a future shaped by both caution and hope. The soil and water around Chernobyl carry the invisible weight of the disaster, holding the echoes of that fateful night in April 1986 when the reactor exploded and sent radioactive particles cascading across the land. These elements, cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium isotopes, settled unevenly, some sinking deep into the earth, while others lingered in the upper layers, clinging to the surfaces that sustain life. For the people who once tilled these fields or drank from these rivers, the land became both an anchor to the past and a constant reminder of the unseen danger that seeped into the very foundation of their existence. The soil, once fertile and nourishing, is now a complex mosaic of contamination. In the Red Forest, one of the most heavily irradiated areas, radioactive particles still bind to organic matter, making the ground a dangerous reservoir of long-lasting toxicity. Farmers who lived in nearby villages were forced to abandon their fields, knowing that the crops they once relied on would now carry the silent threat of internal radiation. Decades later, efforts to remediate the soil, like plowing it under, planting certain types of vegetation, or even removing the top layer entirely, have only been partially successful. The radiation doesn't disappear. It simply moves, redistributed by wind, rain, and erosion, creating pockets of contamination that defy easy management. Water, the lifeblood of any ecosystem, hasn't been spared either. The rivers, lakes, and groundwater in the region absorbed radiation during the initial fallout, with particles like strontium-90, which mimics calcium, settling into sediments and infiltrating aquatic life. The nearby Pripyat River, which flows into the Dnieper River system, became a pathway for radioactive materials to spread far beyond the exclusion zone. Fish in these waters carry traces of radiation, their bodies turning into vessels of contamination that could enter the food chain if consumed. Even now, rain and snow carry radioactive particles from the soil into streams and wetlands, perpetuating the cycle of exposure. For scientists and locals alike, this contamination creates an uneasy relationship with the environment. Tests and monitoring stations provide data, but not always clarity. A bucket of water from a seemingly clean well might test positive for radioactive isotopes, while a nearby pond shows no trace. It's unpredictable, and that uncertainty shapes how people interact with the land. Workers and researchers entering the exclusion zone often tread carefully, aware that the ground beneath their feet and the water they pass are not just passive elements of the landscape, but active participants in the region's ongoing contamination. Yet, for all its challenges, the land and water are not inert victims of the disaster. Nature has a way of responding, adapting in ways that defy easy explanation. Certain plants absorb and even concentrate radiation, while others seem to resist its effects. Aquatic ecosystems adjust, with some species declining while others unexpectedly flourish. These adaptations, however, do not erase the danger. They merely redefine it, showing both the resilience and fragility of life in a place where the natural world has been irrevocably altered. For those who still live on the fringes of the zone or rely on its resources, the contamination is not just a scientific fact but a lived reality. The soil that once promised sustenance now demands caution. The rivers that offered life now hold potential threats. The land remains beautiful, even serene, but its beauty is laced with a kind of betrayal, a reminder of what was lost and the slow, patient recovery that may take generations to unfold. The efforts to clean up and contain the Chernobyl disaster site have been a monumental undertaking, driven by a mix of urgency, ingenuity, and an almost overwhelming sense of responsibility. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, thousands of workers, soldiers, and volunteers, later known as liquidators, descended on the site, knowing full well they were stepping into a place that could claim their health or even their lives. Their mission was to prevent further catastrophe, to seal off the destroyed reactor, and to limit the radioactive spread. Armed with little more than rudimentary protective gear and an unwavering sense of duty, they worked in grueling shifts, pouring sand, lead, and boron into the reactor to suppress the inferno raging within. Their bravery ensured that the world didn't witness an even greater disaster, but it came at a devastating human cost. In the months that followed, engineers and construction crews built the original sarcophagus, a massive concrete and steel structure meant to entomb Reactor 4 and contain the radiation still spewing from the ruins. This hastily built shelter, a triumph of determination but also a product of desperation, was never intended to last. Over time, cracks began to form, and fears grew that it could collapse, unleashing a new wave of radioactive contamination. It became clear that a longer-term solution was needed. Decades later, after years of planning and international cooperation, the new safe confinement was completed. This enormous arch-shaped structure, the largest movable land-based structure ever built, was designed to encase the original sarcophagus and the reactor beneath it. It wasn't just a feat of engineering. It was a statement of global solidarity, funded by dozens of countries that understood the lingering consequences of Chernobyl could not be confined to Ukraine alone. When the new safe confinement was finally slid into place in 2016, it symbolized not just progress but a measure of hope, offering a more secure barrier that could last for a century. Beyond the reactor itself, efforts to decontaminate the surrounding area have been ongoing and complex. Teams have worked to remove radioactive materials from the soil, dismantle contaminated buildings, and bury hazardous waste in specially designed storage facilities. Forests that absorbed fallout have been cut down in sections, with their wood carefully managed to prevent further contamination. These tasks are meticulous and slow, often requiring technology and techniques that are still evolving. Even the land and water within the exclusion zone have seen attempts at rehabilitation. Experimental efforts include planting certain types of vegetation that can absorb radioactive elements from the soil, effectively acting as natural filters. However, the scale of the contamination means these measures, while promising, are small steps in a process that could take centuries to complete. For those involved in these efforts, the work is deeply personal. Some are scientists drawn by the challenge of understanding and mitigating radiation's effects. Others are locals who feel a profound connection to the land and a need to contribute to its recovery. Their stories are a mix of resilience and determination, marked by moments of progress, but also sobering reminders of the disaster's enduring impact. They know their work will not see an end in their lifetimes. Yet they press on, driven by a belief that their actions, however incremental, are vital for the future. Chernobyl's cleanup and containment is not just an engineering project or a scientific endeavor. It's a collective act of redemption and responsibility. It represents humanity's attempt to reckon with the consequences of its mistakes while laying the groundwork for a safer, more thoughtful relationship with the powerful technologies that shape our world. It's imperfect, incomplete, and ongoing, but it stands as a testament to what can be achieved when people come together to confront even the most daunting of challenges. The new safe confinement is more than a structure. It's a monument to human determination in the face of catastrophe. Decades after the Chernobyl disaster, the sarcophagus hastily built to contain the destroyed reactor began to show its flaws. Time and radiation had weakened the original concrete and steel, and cracks had started to spread, threatening to release radioactive dust into the air once again. The stakes were as high as they had been in 1986. Another collapse could send waves of contamination across the region, undoing years of painstaking cleanup and putting millions of lives at risk. The new safe confinement was conceived as the answer to this ticking clock, a project designed not only to stabilize the site but also to represent a more enduring solution. Building it was an extraordinary challenge. Engineers had to design a structure large enough to enclose the reactor and its failing sarcophagus, yet strong enough to withstand the corrosive effects of radiation for at least a century. They also had to ensure the safety of the workers who would construct it, a task complicated by the persistent radiation levels in the area. The result was a massive, arch-shaped steel structure, taller than the Statue of Liberty and wide enough to span 2 football fields. It wasn't just a technical marvel. It was a logistical one. The entire confinement had to be assembled piece by piece at a distance from the reactor, and then slid into place using specialized tracks, a delicate operation that took years to complete. What makes the new safe confinement remarkable is not just its size or design, but what it allows humanity to do. Beneath its protective shell, teams can now begin the painstaking process of dismantling the old sarcophagus and safely managing the radioactive material still housed within Reactor 4. It's not a quick fix. This work will take decades, and the confinement itself is a temporary measure in the grand timeline of nuclear decay. But it buys time, a precious commodity when dealing with a disaster that will leave its mark for thousands of years. The confinement also carries a deeply human message. It was funded by an international coalition, a rare example of nations coming together to address a problem that transcends borders. The teams that built it included experts from around the world, all bringing their knowledge and resources to bear on a shared challenge. For those who worked on it, the confinement was more than a job. It was a responsibility to future generations, a promise that such disasters would not be ignored or forgotten. Standing in the shadow of the new safe confinement, one might feel both awe and unease. It is a symbol of human ingenuity and resilience, but also a stark reminder of our capacity for error and the long shadows those errors can cast. It tells a story of progress and caution, of learning from tragedy while grappling with its lingering consequences. For all its steel and engineering, what the structure truly encapsulates is humanity's capacity to confront its past while striving for a safer, more responsible future. The lessons of Chernobyl are etched not just in policy changes and safety protocols, but in the lives and stories of those who lived through it. The disaster exposed the fragility of systems that relied on secrecy, complacency, and an overconfidence in technology without accounting for human error. At its core, the tragedy was not just a failure of machinery, but of the people and structures meant to oversee it. Reactor 4's explosion was the result of a flawed design and a risky test carried out under pressure, but the real catastrophe unfolded because warnings were ignored, procedures were inadequate, and accountability was sidelined in favor of maintaining appearances. One of the most glaring lessons was the importance of transparency. In the critical hours after the explosion, information was withheld, delayed, or outright denied. This lack of communication not only endangered workers and first responders, but also communities living downwind of the fallout. Many were left unaware of the radioactive cloud drifting toward them, breathing in contamination and continuing their daily routines, unaware of the invisible danger. In the years since, international standards have emphasized openness in reporting incidents, ensuring that no warning is muffled, no risk underestimated, no matter how politically inconvenient. Another revelation was the necessity of robust safety systems. Chernobyl's RBMK reactor design had fundamental flaws, including a tendency to become unstable at low power and a lack of a proper containment structure. These issues were known but never addressed until it was too late. After the disaster, nuclear industries worldwide took a hard look at their own practices. Reactor designs were re-evaluated, safety redundancies were strengthened, and training programs became more rigorous. The industry learned that it couldn't afford shortcuts, not when the stakes involved entire ecosystems and countless lives. The human factor also came into sharp focus. Those working in the control room the night of the disaster were highly skilled but lacked a full understanding of the reactor's quirks and dangers. This wasn't a failure of intelligence or dedication. It was a failure of preparation and education. Post-Chernobyl, training became more comprehensive, with operators now expected to understand not just how to run a reactor, but also its vulnerabilities and the potential consequences of their actions. Simulations, drills, and international collaboration have become standard, ensuring that the people in charge are better equipped to handle the unexpected. Perhaps the most profound lesson was the need for humility. Chernobyl shattered the illusion that nuclear power was an untouchable pinnacle of human achievement, immune to disaster. It forced a reckoning with the reality that even the most advanced systems are fallible, and even the smallest errors can cascade into devastating consequences. This humility has driven a culture of constant questioning and improvement, recognizing that vigilance must be ongoing, not just during construction or initial operation, but throughout the lifespan of every facility. For the world, Chernobyl became a symbol of both the potential and the peril of nuclear energy. It underscored the need to balance the pursuit of progress with the responsibility to protect lives and the environment. And for those who live with its legacy, scientists, policymakers, and the people of the affected regions, it remains a reminder that safety isn't just about protocols and engineering, but about a shared commitment to learning, adapting, and remembering. The disaster taught us that while mistakes are inevitable, their consequences don't have to be if we face them with courage and an unrelenting desire to do better. Chernobyl left a scar not only on the land but also on the collective psyche of humanity, profoundly shaping how people view nuclear power. Before the disaster, nuclear energy was often portrayed as a marvel of modern engineering, a beacon of progress that promised clean, almost limitless power. For many, it symbolized the future, a technological triumph over the limitations of fossil fuels. But in the early hours of April 26, 1986, that image was shattered. The explosion at Reactor 4 revealed nuclear energy's darker side, its potential for catastrophe, and its devastating consequences when something goes wrong. This shift in perception wasn't just about facts and figures, it was about fear. Fear of what cannot be seen, controlled, or easily understood. For the public, the images of Chernobyl were haunting and unforgettable. The ghostly, abandoned streets of Pripyat, the harrowing accounts of radiation sickness, and the sight of a reactor reduced to rubble. These weren't abstract risks or hypothetical scenarios. They were tangible and horrifying. People saw how one moment of failure could render entire regions uninhabitable and displace thousands of lives. The invisible nature of radiation made it even more terrifying, a silent, pervasive threat that couldn't be touched or smelled but lingered for decades. This fear seeped into public consciousness, coloring how nuclear power was viewed around the world. In countries with existing nuclear programs, Chernobyl sparked waves of protests and demands for change. The disaster became a rallying cry for anti-nuclear movements, giving them a powerful, real-world example of the risks they had warned about for years. Governments faced mounting pressure to halt the construction of new reactors, shut down older ones, or invest in alternative energy sources. Some countries, like Germany, responded by committing to phase out nuclear power entirely, a decision that continues to shape their energy policies today. In other places, public trust in regulatory bodies and industry assurances eroded, leaving people skeptical of any claim that nuclear energy could ever be safe. For many, the disaster also created an emotional distance from nuclear power. It became harder to see reactors as mere technological marvels when they were now tied to stories of loss and displacement. The human cost of Chernobyl, the lives cut short, the families uprooted, the ongoing health struggles, became inseparable from the idea of nuclear energy. Even those who understood its potential for reducing carbon emissions or providing reliable energy found it difficult to reconcile those benefits with the images of devastation that had been burned into their minds. However, the influence of Chernobyl on public perception hasn't been entirely uniform or static. In the years since, as climate change has become an ever more urgent crisis, some perspectives have shifted. For those advocating for nuclear power as a low-carbon alternative, the lessons of Chernobyl have been reframed as reasons for reform rather than rejection. They argue that modern reactors, with advanced safety features and rigorous oversight, are worlds apart from the flawed RBMK design and the lax safety culture that led to the disaster. Still, these arguments often face an uphill battle against the lingering fears and emotional weight that Chernobyl carries. Ultimately, Chernobyl's legacy is complex and deeply human. It revealed not just the risks of nuclear power, but also the fragility of trust, the importance of transparency, and the devastating cost of failure. For many, it cast a long shadow over the technology, one that hasn't fully lifted even decades later. And while the conversation around nuclear energy continues to evolve, Chernobyl remains an indelible part of that narrative, a reminder of both the potential and the peril of harnessing the atom. When people think of nuclear disasters, Chernobyl often comes to mind first, its name synonymous with catastrophe. But it is not alone in the history of nuclear accidents. Other disasters, though different in scale and circumstance, have also left lasting marks on the world. Among these, the Fukushima Daiichi disaster in Japan and the 3 Mile Island accident in the United States stand out, each carrying its own lessons and tragedies. Fukushima Daiichi in 2011 was a disaster born from nature's fury and human vulnerability. An earthquake struck off the coast of Japan, triggering a tsunami that overwhelmed the plant's defenses. The walls meant to protect the reactors from the sea were too low, and when the waves crashed over them, they knocked out power and cooling systems. Without the ability to cool the reactors, heat built up, leading to explosions and meltdowns. Radioactive material was released into the environment, contaminating air, soil, and water. Tens of thousands of people were evacuated, their homes and livelihoods left behind. Unlike Chernobyl, which was the result of human error and a flawed reactor design, Fukushima was a stark reminder that even modern facilities are not invincible in the face of natural disasters. Yet, like Chernobyl, it exposed gaps in planning and oversight, particularly the failure to anticipate worst-case scenarios. The 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, while less dramatic, was a pivotal moment in the history of nuclear power. It occurred in Pennsylvania when a series of mechanical failures and human errors caused a partial meltdown in one of the plant's reactors. Unlike Chernobyl or Fukushima, there were no explosions or massive releases of radiation, and no immediate deaths were reported. Yet, the psychological impact was profound. For the first time, the American public was confronted with the tangible risks of nuclear energy. The images of the plant and the fear of what could have been sparked a wave of anti-nuclear sentiment, halting the construction of new reactors in the United States for decades. In many ways, 3 Mile Island was a warning, a near miss that underscored the importance of vigilance, transparency, and robust safety protocols. Comparing these disasters to Chernobyl highlights both similarities and differences. Chernobyl remains the most catastrophic in terms of immediate human and environmental impact. The reactor's explosion released more radiation than either Fukushima or 3 Mile Island, and the lack of a containment structure allowed it to spread uncontrollably. The response to Chernobyl was chaotic and shrouded in secrecy, exacerbating the suffering of those affected. In contrast, Fukushima and 3 Mile Island occurred in contexts where communication, though flawed, was far more open, and international assistance played a significant role in the response. Yet all three disasters share a common thread. They revealed the fragility of systems we often assume to be fail-safe. Whether through flawed designs, natural disasters, or human error, they demonstrated that nuclear energy, while powerful and efficient, is not without risks. They also underscored the resilience of those affected. In Fukushima, communities have slowly begun to rebuild, though the scars remain. In Pennsylvania, the lessons of 3 Mile Island continue to inform safety practices. And in the shadow of Chernobyl, life, in its strange and adaptive way, has found a way to persist. These disasters are reminders of both the potential and the peril of nuclear power. They invite reflection on how we balance progress with caution, innovation with accountability. For those who lived through them, they are not just events in history but deeply personal experiences that shape how we view energy, technology, and our responsibility to future generations. Each disaster, in its own way, is a testament to the complexity of harnessing the atom, a force that holds the promise of light but also the shadow of devastation. Chernobyl cast a long shadow over the discussions of renewable energy and climate change, serving as both a cautionary tale and a point of reflection. As the world grapples with the urgency of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the specter of nuclear power, a technology capable of generating immense amounts of energy with almost no carbon emissions, looms large. Yet, the memory of Chernobyl complicates the narrative, reminding us of the high stakes and risks involved in harnessing nuclear energy. For many, Chernobyl represents the darkest possibilities of relying on nuclear power. It reinforced fears about the safety of nuclear plants, the challenges of managing radioactive waste, and the human cost of mistakes or mismanagement. This fear has often fueled skepticism toward nuclear energy as a viable solution for combating climate change, pushing people and governments to seek alternatives that feel safer and more sustainable. At the same time, Chernobyl has sharpened the debate about the urgency of transitioning away from fossil fuels. The rising toll of climate change, intensifying storms, rising sea levels, and unrelenting heat waves has made the need for low-carbon energy solutions undeniable. Nuclear power, despite its risks, offers a level of energy production that renewable sources like wind and solar currently struggle to match on their own. It provides consistent, reliable power, something that the variability of sunlight and wind cannot guarantee without significant advancements in energy storage. This has led some climate advocates to argue that nuclear energy must play a role, at least as a bridge technology, while renewables scale up. Chernobyl's legacy also informs discussions about how to approach energy policy responsibly. It highlights the necessity of rigorous safety standards, transparency, and public trust in any energy system we adopt. The mistakes that led to Chernobyl were as much about human failings as technical ones. Complacency, secrecy, and underestimating risks. In today's context, this lesson applies broadly, from the siting of wind farms to the ethical sourcing of materials for solar panels. The transition to a cleaner energy future requires more than just adopting new technologies. It demands a culture of accountability and foresight. In a way, Chernobyl has become a symbol of both what we fear and what we strive to avoid in the fight against climate change. It reminds us of the immense power we wield when we reshape the natural world to meet our needs, and of the responsibility that comes with it. For some, this has meant rejecting nuclear power outright, focusing instead on wind, solar, and geothermal energy as safer, more sustainable options. For others, it has meant doubling down on making nuclear energy safer, pointing to newer reactor designs and advancements in technology as ways to prevent another disaster. The site itself, with its strange mixture of desolation and rebirth, is often cited in these discussions. In the exclusion zone, where nature has reclaimed abandoned towns, some see a grim warning about humanity's impact on the planet. A glimpse of a world where we fail to act on climate change. Others see a symbol of resilience and the possibility of renewal. A reminder that even in the aftermath of catastrophe, life can find a way forward. In this sense, Chernobyl is not just a place or a moment in history. It is a lens through which we examine our choices, weighing the risks of action against the consequences of inaction as we chart a path toward a more sustainable future. The way a disaster is remembered and commemorated often reveals the deep scars it has left on those who survived and the legacy it has etched into a community's identity. For many, the act of remembering goes beyond ceremonies and monuments. It becomes a thread woven into everyday life, a reminder of fragility and resilience. Survivors recount stories that balance pain and pride, sharing their memories with a raw honesty that often transcends generations. Their voices, trembling yet firm, recount moments of loss but also of unthinkable courage, of neighbors becoming saviors, and of strangers offering comfort in the bleakest hours. In towns and cities, markers, whether modest plaques or grand memorials, stand silently, urging passers-by to pause and reflect. Schools teach the events not as distant history but as lessons in empathy and preparedness, encouraging the young to see the humanity in tragedy. Public gatherings, held on anniversaries, transform grief into solidarity, where candles are lit, names are spoken aloud, and moments of silence bridge the living with the memory of those lost. These acts, small as they may seem, tether communities to a shared narrative of endurance. Yet the commemoration isn't always confined to formal rituals. Families who lost loved ones often find personal ways to keep their memories alive. A mother might plant a tree that grows with the years, its shade a quiet tribute. A father might share a worn photograph, his voice cracking as he describes the smile that once graced their household. Children who never knew the victims may leave flowers at sites of significance, as if to say, "You are not forgotten." These intimate gestures hold as much weight as any public ceremony, reminding us that grief is as personal as it is collective. Over time, art and literature become vessels of remembrance. Poems, paintings, and songs capture emotions that words cannot fully express. They immortalize not just the sorrow but the humanity that emerged amidst chaos. Survivors might collaborate with artists or authors, lending their voices to ensure the disaster isn't reduced to mere statistics or dates. Their contributions transform remembrance into something alive, capable of inspiring and teaching even those who never experienced the event firsthand. Technology, too, plays a role in modern remembrance. Social media campaigns and digital archives make stories accessible to wider audiences, creating spaces for reflection and dialogue. Hashtags link strangers across continents, showing that while pain may be rooted in a specific place and time, its echoes are universal. Documentaries and virtual experiences allow people to step into the past, not as detached observers but as empathetic participants, feeling the weight of what was lost and the power of what was rebuilt. Ultimately, how a disaster is remembered is a testament to humanity's need to find meaning in suffering. It's not just about honoring the past, but about shaping the future, ensuring that lessons are learned, lives are celebrated, and hope persists even in the face of despair. Each act of remembrance, no matter how grand or small, is a bridge between what was and what could be, carried forward by the people who refused to let those moments fade into silence. Life in Pripyat before the explosion was vibrant, filled with a sense of promise and pride that comes with living in a city designed for a purpose. Built to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and their families, it was a young city in every sense. Its population was predominantly under 30, and its infrastructure was modern and carefully planned. Streets were wide and orderly, lined with trees that whispered in the breeze, their leaves catching the light from a sky that, for those who lived there, seemed to hold only possibilities. For families, Pripyat offered a quality of life that was envied in many other parts of the Soviet Union. Children played in colorful parks filled with laughter that echoed off the walls of the city's numerous schools and kindergartens. Parents, many of them engineers, scientists, and skilled workers, felt pride in their contributions to the nation's ambitious energy program. Weekends often meant trips to the Pripyat River, where the water shimmered under the sun, and picnics were laid out on its banks, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread, roasted meat, and the occasional pop of a champagne cork. The city's center was a hub of social and cultural activity. Restaurants served hearty Soviet fare alongside dishes inspired by Ukrainian traditions. There were theaters and a cultural center where music, art, and plays brought people together, offering a break from the routine of daily life. A newly built amusement park, though scheduled to officially open on May Day 1986, had already begun to delight children with its Ferris wheel and bumper cars. It stood as a beacon of joy, a promise of even brighter days ahead. Everyday life in Pripyat was a balance of work and leisure, much like anywhere else. Workers at the power plant left early in the morning, their uniforms crisp, their strides purposeful as they walked toward what many saw as the future of Soviet progress. At home, radios played popular tunes, and televisions broadcast both Soviet propaganda and entertainment. Markets bustled with the chatter of shoppers, haggling over fresh produce and goods brought in from nearby towns. Evenings often saw neighbors gathered around kitchen tables, sharing stories over tea and vodka, their laughter spilling out into the warm nights. Despite the city's apparent utopia, there were hints of the weight that came with living in a place so closely tied to the Soviet government's aspirations. The power plant, though a source of pride, loomed large over the city, its smokestacks a constant reminder of the work that made Pripyat possible. Life was good, filled with the ordinary joys of human connection and the unshakable belief that the future was bright. Pripyat before the explosion wasn't just a place. It was a story of people, of lives intertwined by hope and purpose. It was a city where young couples dreamed of raising families, where friendships were forged in the glow of streetlights, and where a community thrived against the backdrop of a world that, unbeknownst to them, was about to change forever. The economic impacts of the Chernobyl disaster on Ukraine were profound, a burden that stretched far beyond the immediate aftermath and continues to shape the country's financial landscape even decades later. For those who lived through it, the disaster turned the promise of progress into an enduring struggle for survival, reshaping lives and livelihoods in ways that could never have been imagined. Entire communities, once thriving, were uprooted, leaving behind empty homes, abandoned schools, and the eerie silence of a place frozen in time. The cost of relocation, rebuilding, and managing the aftermath became a weight that the nation carried on its back. In the immediate years following the explosion, Ukraine's economy reeled under the enormous costs of evacuation and resettlement. Nearly 350,000 people were forced to leave their homes, many of them abandoning not just possessions but entire ways of life. Farms that had fed thousands were left untended, and businesses that had anchored communities were shuttered. For those displaced, starting over meant grappling with unemployment and the challenge of integrating into new environments, often with little support. The psychological toll of this upheaval, felt in the uncertainty of finding work, the loss of community, and the sheer act of surviving, only deepened the economic strain. The government faced insurmountable expenses in containing the radioactive fallout. Efforts to decontaminate the environment, construct the original sarcophagus to encase the reactor, and later replace it with the new safe confinement structure drained billions of dollars. These were funds that might otherwise have fueled development, improved infrastructure, or addressed social needs. Instead, they were swallowed by the ongoing fight against an invisible enemy that lingered in the soil, the air, and the water. It wasn't just a one-time expense. It became a persistent economic black hole, demanding constant attention and resources. Agriculture, a cornerstone of Ukraine's economy, was devastated. Large swathes of farmland were contaminated, rendering them unusable for generations. This wasn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. It was about farmers who had tilled the same soil their ancestors had worked, now faced with the unbearable reality that their land, their livelihood, was poisoned. Livestock had to be culled, crops destroyed, and entire industries restructured as the nation grappled with the loss of its agricultural heartland. For rural families, it meant a life forever altered, where traditions tied to the land were replaced by uncertainty and loss. Tourism, which might have flourished in Ukraine's picturesque countryside and historic cities, also suffered. The stigma of being the site of one of the world's worst nuclear disasters cast a shadow over the country, deterring visitors and investments. While recent years have seen Chernobyl itself become a grim tourist attraction, the economic potential of other regions was stunted for decades by the Disasters Association. On a broader scale, the disaster highlighted the weaknesses of the Soviet economic system, which Ukraine inherited upon its independence in 1991. The resources funneled into managing Chernobyl drained the capacity for investment in modernization and development, leaving the fledgling nation grappling with a legacy of underfunded institutions and infrastructure. International aid and loans helped ease some of the burden, but they also tethered Ukraine to external debt, adding another layer of complexity to its economic challenges. For the people of Ukraine, the economic impacts of Chernobyl have always been deeply personal. It's felt in the empty villages that once bustled with life, in the families split apart by resettlement, and in the quiet desperation of those who have lived their entire lives under its shadow. The disaster's cost isn't just measured in currency but in dreams deferred, lives disrupted, and futures forever altered. Visiting Chernobyl as a tourist is an experience wrapped in contradictions. A journey to a place of profound devastation that now draws people from around the world seeking to understand its history and witness its eerie transformation. For many, the decision to visit carries an undercurrent of unease. The name, Chernobyl, still conjures images of radioactive fallout and the chilling aftermath of one of the world's worst nuclear disasters. Yet, for those who make the trip, the reality is far more nuanced, a mixture of somber reflection and cautious reassurance. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone is considered safe for carefully managed tourism. Strict regulations govern every aspect of a visit, from the routes taken to the duration of time spent in certain areas. Tour guides, often with deep personal connections to the region, lead groups through checkpoints and along paths deemed low risk for radiation exposure. These guides carry dosimeters, constantly monitoring radiation levels to ensure visitors remain within safe limits. The air is filled with stories of the disaster, of the lives forever altered, and of the natural world reclaiming what was abandoned. Walking through Pripyat, the once thriving city left to the wilderness, visitors feel the weight of the silence. The schoolrooms are frozen in time, with textbooks still open on desks and faded posters clinging to the walls. The Ferris wheel, its yellow gondolas rusting under the open sky, stands as a haunting reminder of a life interrupted. It's not just a place to see but a place to feel, a stark juxtaposition of human loss and nature's persistence. The wildlife, from thriving wolf packs to herds of wild horses, tells a story of survival in a landscape that humans were forced to abandon. Tourists often describe a sense of awe mixed with unease. The knowledge that they are walking in a place marked by such profound tragedy can be overwhelming. But the guides, many of whom lived through the evacuation or have family ties to the area, bring a human element to the narrative. They share memories of their lives before the disaster, the panic of evacuation, and the resilience of those who refuse to forget their home. Their presence adds depth to the experience, reminding visitors that Chernobyl is not just a relic but a part of ongoing history. Safety measures are strict. Visitors are prohibited from touching structures, sitting on the ground, or taking anything out of the zone. Clothing is checked for contamination before departure, and most tours last only a day to minimize exposure. For those who follow these guidelines, the radiation exposure during a visit is often compared to that of a transatlantic flight. Minimal and fleeting. However, it's a reassurance that doesn't entirely erase the invisible tension of being in a place where danger once lingered in every breath. For some, the decision to visit is driven by curiosity. For others, it's a pilgrimage to understand a pivotal moment in human history. Many leave with a deeper appreciation for the fragility of life and the resilience of nature. While it is safe under controlled conditions, the experience is not one to be taken lightly. It's not just a destination, it's a lesson, a reminder of what was lost, and a testament to the stories that continue to emerge from the shadow of Chernobyl. The internet and social media have breathed new life into the story of Chernobyl, transforming it from a dark chapter of history into a subject of global fascination and dialogue. What was once confined to textbooks and somber documentaries now unfolds across digital platforms, where personal stories, archival footage, and stunning images converge to give the tragedy a new dimension. For those who experienced it firsthand, the internet offers a platform to share their voices, their memories, and their pain, ensuring that their stories are not forgotten but reach new generations who might otherwise have remained unaware. Through social media, the haunting landscapes of the Chernobyl exclusion zone have found an audience far removed from the physical site. Photographers and filmmakers document the ghostly beauty of Pripyat and the surrounding areas, capturing decaying buildings overtaken by nature, silent classrooms filled with dust, and the rusting Ferris wheel standing against a stark sky. These images spread rapidly, resonating with viewers who are drawn not just to their aesthetic, but to the weight of the history they represent. Each post, each video, becomes a portal into a world both frozen in time and teeming with untold stories. The internet has also transformed how people learn about Chernobyl. Detailed articles, video essays, and forums provide insights into the science, politics, and human impact of the disaster. Online communities, from Reddit threads to YouTube comment sections, bring together people from around the world to discuss everything from the reactor's design flaws to the lives of the liquidators who risked everything to contain the damage. In these digital spaces, the narrative of Chernobyl evolves, shaped by diverse perspectives and fueled by a shared desire to understand its complexities. Television and film have played a significant role in this revival, with shows like the critically acclaimed Chernobyl sparking widespread interest. After the series aired, social media platforms lit up with discussions as viewers sought to fact-check dramatized scenes, share their emotional reactions, and explore deeper layers of the story. Survivors and experts joined the conversation, offering corrections, affirmations, and insights, creating a bridge between historical reality and modern storytelling. The dialogue extended beyond the show itself, reigniting debates about nuclear safety, government accountability, and the human cost of technological ambition. Influencers and content creators have also made Chernobyl accessible to audiences who might never have sought it out on their own. Travel vloggers share their experiences touring the zone, blending awe and respect as they recount walking through abandoned streets or standing before the new safe confinement. Their narratives, often raw and personal, invite viewers to see Chernobyl not just as a site of tragedy, but as a space for reflection and learning. Their posts generate questions, discussions, and a ripple effect of curiosity that draws more people into the story. Perhaps most profoundly, the internet has allowed those most affected by Chernobyl to reclaim their narrative. Survivors, former residents, and the children of liquidators share their stories online, often in deeply personal posts or videos. These accounts, unfiltered and deeply human, cut through the abstraction of statistics and history, reminding audiences of the individuals behind the headlines. Their words carry a weight that lingers, challenging viewers to consider not just what happened, but how it continues to shape lives today. In this digital age, Chernobyl is no longer just a moment in time. It's a living story, constantly revisited, re-examined, and reimagined. The internet and social media have ensured that its lessons remain visible, its victims remembered, and its warnings heeded. It's a revival not born of morbid curiosity, but of a collective need to understand, connect, and ensure that the past shapes a safer future. The RBMK reactor, the type used at Chernobyl, was a technological product of its time, shaped by the priorities and limitations of the Soviet Union. It was a reactor designed for dual purposes, generating electricity and producing plutonium for potential military use. On the surface, it appeared efficient and cost-effective, capable of generating vast amounts of energy. But beneath this exterior lay critical design flaws that turned it into a ticking time bomb. To those who worked with it daily, the reactor was both a symbol of progress and a system that demanded constant vigilance, its quirks and vulnerabilities understood but often underestimated. At its core, the RBMK's most dangerous flaw was its positive void coefficient, a feature invisible to the untrained eye but fatal in its implications. When water, which served as the reactor's coolant, began to boil, the formation of steam, known as voids, would unexpectedly accelerate the nuclear reaction instead of slowing it down. This was counterintuitive and perilous. It meant that under certain conditions, a reactor designed to produce controlled power could spiral out of control, amplifying itself in a dangerous feedback loop. For operators, this flaw was like walking a tightrope, where any misstep could lead to disaster. Another critical issue was the reactor's graphite-tipped control rods, a design feature that tragically turned safety equipment into a potential hazard. These rods were meant to regulate the reactor's power output, but their tips were made of graphite, which could momentarily increase reactivity when inserted into the core. During the critical moments of the Chernobyl disaster, when operators attempted to shut down the reactor, the design of these rods caused a brief but catastrophic surge in reactivity. It was a devastating irony. The very mechanism meant to save the reactor instead became the trigger for its explosion. The RBMK's design also lacked a robust containment structure, a glaring omission that underscored a broader prioritization of efficiency and cost over safety. Unlike many Western reactors, which were housed within thick concrete domes capable of withstanding explosions or leaks, the RBMK was exposed. When Reactor 4 at Chernobyl exploded, there was nothing to contain the radioactive materials that were hurled into the atmosphere. This design choice wasn't just a technical flaw, it was a stark reflection of a system that often ignored potential risks in favor of meeting production goals. For the operators tasked with managing these reactors, many of these flaws weren't immediately apparent. The RBMK was complex and demanded deep technical knowledge, but the training provided to many of its staff was insufficient to handle its peculiarities. Miscommunication, inadequate safety protocols, and a culture that discouraged questioning authority further compounded the risks. On the night of the disaster, the operators were faced with the reactor behaving in ways they hadn't been fully prepared to understand, let alone control. Looking back, it's clear that the RBMK's flaws were not just technical but systemic. They were born from a culture that valued rapid progress and economic output over caution and resilience. For those who worked with these reactors, the disaster wasn't just a failure of machinery. It was a betrayal of trust in a system that had promised them safety and control. The lessons of Chernobyl extend far beyond the specifics of the RBMK reactor, reminding the world of the profound responsibility that comes with harnessing such powerful technology. When the explosion at Chernobyl's Reactor 4 tore through the night, it unleashed a torrent of radiation so vast and uncontrolled that it defied comprehension. In the seconds following the blast, over 400 times more radioactive material was released into the atmosphere than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But unlike the immediate flash and destruction of an atomic explosion, the radiation from Chernobyl seeped into the world insidiously, spreading with the wind, contaminating the earth, and altering the lives of millions in ways that were invisible yet devastating. For the people near the plant, the danger was incomprehensible at first. The initial explosion sent a plume of radioactive isotopes, including cesium-137, iodine-131, and strontium-90, high into the air. These particles carried energy that could tear apart cells, disrupt DNA, and cause cancers that would emerge years or even decades later. But to the residents of Pripyat, just a few kilometers away, the night sky lit up with a strange, almost beautiful glow, red and blue, shimmering like a surreal aurora. Many gathered on bridges and rooftops to watch, unaware that they were bathing in lethal doses of radiation. Later, that bridge would be hauntingly named the Bridge of Death, its spectators succumbing to illnesses born of that moment of wonder. The sheer scale of the radiation release defied any local response. Firefighters, many of them young men barely out of their teens, rushed to the scene without protective gear, their only thought being to control the blaze and save lives. They didn't know that the blackened graphite scattered around the site was highly radioactive, or that the air itself carried invisible death. They worked tirelessly, dousing the fire with water and sand, breathing in the toxic air, and touching materials that emitted radiation thousands of times beyond what a human body could endure. Many of them would pay with their lives in the days and weeks that followed, their bodies succumbing to acute radiation syndrome, a horrifying condition that stripped away their health with agonizing speed. The radiation didn't stop at Chernobyl. Carried by the wind, it traveled across borders, turning neighboring Belarus into one of the most affected areas. It reached as far as Scandinavia, where Swedish scientists were among the first to detect the spike in radiation levels, forcing the Soviet Union to admit to the disaster. For farmers in these regions, the fallout meant their crops and livestock were contaminated. Fields that had fed families for generations became unusable. Milk, vegetables, and water were tainted, forcing hard choices between hunger and the slow poison of radiation. The comparison to Hiroshima is both staggering and misleading. While the atomic bomb in Hiroshima caused immediate, unimaginable destruction and killed tens of thousands in an instant, the radiation it released dissipated relatively quickly. Chernobyl's radiation, however, was a slow and lasting threat. Cesium-137, one of the main isotopes released, has a half-life of 30 years, meaning the land it contaminated will remain dangerous for centuries. The fallout from Chernobyl didn't just devastate one city. It poisoned vast swathes of land, making homes, forests, and farmlands unsafe for generations. The human cost of this release cannot be measured solely in numbers or isotopes. It's in the stories of mothers who were forced to leave everything behind, clutching their children as they boarded buses to nowhere. It's in the eyes of liquidators, those conscripted to clean up the mess, who knew they were sacrificing their health and often their lives to contain a disaster they barely understood. It's in the silence that now blankets the exclusion zone, a silence that echoes with the lives that were disrupted, the futures that were erased. The release of 400 times more radiation than Hiroshima is not just a statistic. It's a testament to the scale of human and environmental suffering. It serves as a stark reminder of the cost of technological failure, of what happens when ambition outpaces caution, and of the delicate balance between progress and the forces we seek to control. For those who lived through it, and for the world that watched, it is a warning that lingers as persistently as the radiation itself. Deep within the ruined remains of Reactor 4 at Chernobyl lies the elephant's foot, a molten mass of radioactive material that has become a grim symbol of the disaster. Born out of chaos, it formed during the explosion when the reactor's core melted down, combining nuclear fuel, graphite, and sand into a searing, unearthly substance. At its discovery, the elephant's foot was lethally radioactive, a force so potent that standing near it for even a few minutes could deliver a fatal dose of radiation. For those who encountered it in those early days, it was not just a scientific anomaly but an almost alien presence, a reminder of the uncontrollable power that had been unleashed. In the aftermath of the explosion, as emergency crews worked tirelessly to stabilize the reactor and assess the damage, the elephant's foot was discovered beneath the reactor, nestled in a maze of collapsed structures and debris. Its appearance was surreal, resembling the cracked, grayish texture of an elephant's hide, hence its name. It was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a testament to the intense heat and pressure that had transformed solid materials into a toxic, viscous flow. For the liquidators, those brave workers tasked with exploring and documenting the reactor's bowels, it was an object of immense danger and fascination, something they could only approach for fleeting moments before retreating to avoid lethal exposure. Initially, the radiation levels near the elephant's foot were so extreme that even brief proximity could cause severe burns, nausea, and almost certain death within hours or days. Photos taken of it during this period are haunting, a mix of blurred edges and ghostly shadows, artifacts of the radiation interfering with the film. To the scientists and workers who studied it, the elephant's foot was both a deadly hazard and a puzzle to be solved, representing the chaotic aftermath of the reactor's failure. Understanding it meant understanding the scope of the disaster and the challenges of containment. As the years passed, the elephant's foot cooled and became less immediately deadly, though it remains highly radioactive to this day. The initial intensity of its emissions has decreased, but standing too close to it still carries serious risks. Time has rendered it more stable, allowing scientists to study it more closely and understand the complex chemical reactions that occurred during the meltdown. It is a sobering reminder of how the disaster's legacy endures, not just in the stories of those affected, but in physical forms that defy decay and demand respect. For those who have seen it, either in person or through images, the elephant's foot is not just a mass of molten material. It's a crystallization of the disaster's most profound truths. It embodies the raw power of nuclear energy, the catastrophic consequences of human error, and the immense courage of the people who risked everything to confront it. Standing before it, even in protective gear, is to stand before a monument to both human ambition and its fragility, to the hubris that thought such power could be tamed without consequence. The elephant's foot remains where it formed, buried in the ruins of Reactor 4, a silent yet unyielding witness to the night that changed the world. Its presence is a chilling reminder of the price of failure and a warning to future generations about the responsibility that comes with wielding forces as immense as those unleashed at Chernobyl. When Reactor 4 at Chernobyl exploded in the early hours of April 26, 1986, the Soviet Union's first response wasn't to alert the world or even its own citizens. It was to hide the truth. In a system built on control, secrecy, and the suppression of bad news, the disaster was not just a catastrophe but a threat to the state's carefully cultivated image of infallibility. The radioactive cloud that was already spreading across borders couldn't be contained, but the information about it was tightly locked away. For the people in Pripyat and the surrounding areas, this denial of reality was more than a failure of governance. It was a betrayal that cost lives. In the immediate aftermath, the magnitude of the explosion was downplayed. Local residents went about their day as usual, unaware that the air they were breathing carried invisible danger. Children played outside, families worked in their gardens, and factory workers reported to their shifts, all under skies that were quietly raining radioactive particles. The authorities in Moscow, having received reports of the accident, prioritized minimizing panic and preserving the Soviet Union's image over taking swift action to protect its citizens. It wasn't until nearly 2 days later, when Swedish scientists detected elevated radiation levels and traced them back to Chernobyl, that the world began to learn the truth. Even then, the Soviet government's admission was vague and understated, a mere acknowledgement that an incident had occurred. For the firefighters, liquidators, and plant workers who were sent into the inferno to contain the disaster, the lack of transparency was deadly. Many weren't informed about the severity of the radiation they were facing or the long-term consequences of exposure. Protective gear was inadequate or non-existent, and the true nature of their task was shrouded in secrecy. They were heroes, but their courage was manipulated. Their sacrifices demanded without full knowledge of the risks. Many paid with their lives, succumbing to acute radiation sickness in the days and weeks that followed. Even as the situation spiraled out of control, the Soviet leadership remained focused on controlling the narrative. News broadcasts downplayed the severity of the accident, and celebrations for May Day, the annual workers' holiday, went ahead as planned in Kiev, less than 100 kilometers from the disaster site. Thousands of people gathered in the streets, marching and celebrating under a radioactive sky, oblivious to the danger. It was an act of defiance against reality, a decision made by officials who prioritized appearances over the safety of their citizens. For the people of Pripyat, the truth came too late. The evacuation order didn't come until 36 hours after the explosion, and when it did, it was delivered without explanation. Residents were told to pack lightly, as they would be returning in a few days. Many left behind their possessions, their pets, their lives, believing they would soon be back. They weren't told that their homes were already contaminated, that their town was no longer safe, or that they would never return. The buses rolled out in silence, carrying tens of thousands of people away from a disaster they didn't fully understand. This culture of secrecy wasn't new. It was deeply embedded in the Soviet system, where admitting failure was seen as a threat to the state. But at Chernobyl, it became a fatal flaw. The denial and obfuscation delayed international assistance, hindered scientific understanding, and allowed the disaster's impact to spread unchecked. It also left a deep scar on the trust between the government and its people, a wound that would never fully heal. The Soviet Union's initial response to Chernobyl is a stark reminder of the dangers of secrecy and the cost of prioritizing image over truth. For those who lived through it, the betrayal was as toxic as the radiation itself, a silent force that poisoned lives and futures. And as the truth slowly emerged, piece by piece, it revealed not just the scale of the disaster but the fragility of a system built on denial. The Chernobyl exclusion zone wasn't created in a single decisive act. It unfolded in stages, growing out of chaos, fear, and the grim realization of how severe the disaster was. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the authorities evacuated the city of Pripyat, just 3 kilometers from the reactor, within 36 hours. The streets were filled with buses, hurriedly transporting tens of thousands of people who believed they would return in a few days. They left behind homes, belongings, and memories, carrying only what they could fit into a bag. But as radiation levels were measured and the scale of contamination became clearer, The evacuation expanded to villages and towns within a larger radius. What started as a protective boundary around the reactor grew into the 30-kilometer zone, a line drawn not just on maps but in the lives of the people who had lived there. For those who were forced to leave, the exclusion zone became a symbol of loss. Loss of community, of land, of a way of life. Farmers abandoned fields their families had tilled for generations, and villagers left behind ancestral homes, their wells, their orchards. The zone wasn't just a no-go area. It was an erasure of normalcy. Soldiers and officials went from house to house, urging, and sometimes forcing, people to leave. They promised it was for their safety, that the danger was too great to stay. But for many, the danger was invisible, impossible to comprehend, and the idea of never returning was unthinkable. They boarded buses with tears in their eyes, glancing back at places they would never see again as they crossed into an uncertain future. Inside the zone, life didn't stop completely. Some refused to leave, mostly the elderly, who couldn't imagine dying anywhere but their homes. They returned quietly, sneaking past patrols or convincing officials they would not be a burden. These self-settlers, as they became known, lived in isolation, tending to their gardens, raising livestock, and adapting to a world where radiation was a constant but unseen threat. Their lives were stripped down to essentials, defined by resilience and a fierce attachment to the land. Meanwhile, the exclusion zone itself became a surreal landscape. Checkpoints were established, and access was tightly controlled. Scientists, soldiers, and engineers moved in to manage the cleanup, measure radiation levels, and contain the spread of contamination. Entire villages were bulldozed, their remains buried in trenches to prevent the radioactive materials in wood and soil from spreading further. Forests grew over roads, wildlife returned, and nature began reclaiming the space humans had been forced to abandon. Over time, the zone transformed into a paradox, a place of both danger and renewal, desolation and life. For those on the outside, the exclusion zone became a shadowy place, a reminder of the disaster and its far-reaching consequences. Its boundaries marked more than just a perimeter around a radioactive site. They marked the divide between the life people once knew and the uncertainty that followed. Decades later, the zone still stands as a stark reminder of Chernobyl's enduring impact, a place where history is preserved not just in ruins but in the absence of what once was. It's a land where the past lingers in every abandoned house, every overgrown path, and every story of those who once called it home. For those who lived through it, the radioactive contamination that spread across Europe after the Chernobyl disaster wasn't just a headline or an abstract threat. It was a slow, creeping shadow that reached into homes, schools, forests, and fields, places where people had once felt safe. In the days and weeks following the explosion, there was a profound sense of confusion, of being caught in something incomprehensibly large and invisible. The initial plume carried radioactive isotopes far beyond the exclusion zone, raining down cesium-137 and strontium-90 over countries hundreds, even thousands, of kilometers away. Farmers watched in disbelief as government officials arrived to test their soil and livestock, telling them their land, often their family's livelihood for generations, was now poisoned. Milk from cows grazing on contaminated grass was suddenly a danger to drink. Entire harvests were declared unfit for consumption. There was a particularly bitter irony for those in regions untouched by war or famine for decades, as they faced an enemy they couldn't see or fight. Parents, terrified and uncertain, told their children to stay indoors, but even within the walls of their homes, the fear lingered. They worried over every meal, every glass of water, wondering if they were unknowingly poisoning their families. For years, and in some places decades, the contamination altered the rhythms of life. Hunters in Scandinavia found reindeer meat contaminated with cesium-137, and mushroom foragers in Germany and Poland were warned about radioactivity absorbed by the soil. In Belarus and Ukraine, children born long after the disaster carried the legacy in their bodies, with higher incidences of thyroid cancer and other illnesses tied to the fallout. People spoke in hushed tones about friends and relatives who had fallen ill, as if naming the sickness might make it more real. The psychological toll was as insidious as the radiation itself, gnawing away at trust in governments, in science, and even in the natural world. Chernobyl became a kind of ghost, not just in the physical exclusion zone, but in the collective consciousness of those living under its shadow. People learned to measure time as before Chernobyl and after Chernobyl. For some, the radioactive contamination was a daily reminder of how fragile life could be, how the most ordinary acts, drinking a glass of milk, walking in the rain, planting a garden, could suddenly turn treacherous. For others, it became something to suppress, a quiet dread pushed to the edges of their minds because acknowledging it too often might make it unbearable. Yet, amid all of this, there was resilience. People found ways to adapt, though always with the understanding that their lives had been fundamentally altered. Communities came together, sharing what little they could to support one another. Scientists worked tirelessly to understand the long-term effects, even as governments were slow to act or, at times, actively suppressed information. In some places, the land began to recover, though not always in ways that welcomed humans back. The forests around Chernobyl became lush again, a hauntingly beautiful reminder of nature's capacity to endure even as human life faltered. The contamination was long-lasting, yes, but so too was the human ability to remember, to mourn, and to continue, however imperfectly, in the face of an enduring nightmare. When humans fled the irradiated lands around Chernobyl, leaving behind homes, schools, and factories to decay in eerie silence, something unexpected began to stir in the absence of people. The wildlife, those creatures that had once scurried from the sound of footsteps or the roar of a passing car, slowly crept back. For the first time in centuries, nature was left to itself. No fences, no hunters, no chainsaws slicing through the quiet. The radioactive contamination that drove people away did not deter the animals. They didn't measure risk in isotopes or half-lives. They simply moved in because the land, poisoned as it was, offered freedom from the greatest predator they had ever known: humanity. The resurgence of wildlife in the Chernobyl exclusion zone feels, at first glance, like a story of hope. Wolves roam the forests now, their howls echoing through the empty villages. Bears, absent from the area for over a century, have returned, lumbering through abandoned farmlands. Wild boars root through soil laced with radioactive particles, while herds of Przewalski's horses, once nearly extinct, graze in meadows that have reclaimed old roads and train tracks. It's easy to romanticize this transformation, to see nature healing in the absence of people, but the reality is far more complex and haunting. The animals that thrive here are not untouched by radiation. Studies have shown mutations in some species: birds with smaller brains, insects with shortened lifespans, rodents with unusual tumors. Yet, these changes don't seem to disrupt the overall populations in a way that would stop life from flourishing. In many cases, the absence of humans is a greater boon to survival than the presence of radiation is a threat. It's a grim paradox. The contamination that makes the land uninhabitable for people has created a sanctuary for animals, a place where they are no longer hunted, poisoned, or displaced by human development. For those who've studied this phenomenon, there's an uneasy tension between awe and sadness. Biologists trekking through the exclusion zone describe the thrill of seeing rare species, of watching ecosystems rebound in unexpected ways. But there's also a deep sense of mourning. This is not a pristine wilderness, but a radioactive one, a place where life persists not because it's thriving in the traditional sense, but because it has no other choice. The sight of a deer grazing in the shadow of a crumbling reactor, or a bird nesting in a rusting Ferris wheel, feels as much like a warning as it does a testament to resilience. And then there's the haunting question: what does this mean for us? If life can adapt, mutate, and endure in a place so profoundly altered by human error, what does that say about the boundaries between destruction and survival? For the scientists, locals, and occasional visitors who pass through the zone, the animals aren't just symbols of resilience. They're reminders of what we've left behind. Watching a wolf trot through the ruins of a village, you can't help but feel a strange mixture of guilt and wonder, a recognition that the line between nature and humanity isn't as clear as we like to think. In the irradiated lands of Chernobyl, wildlife tells a story that is both humbling and unsettling, one in which survival is neither victory nor defeat, but something more complicated, raw, and endlessly evolving. Standing before the new safe confinement at Chernobyl, it's impossible not to feel dwarfed by its sheer magnitude. It looms like a metal colossus over the quiet remains of Reactor No. 4, a stark reminder of the disaster that changed everything here in 1986. The structure, the largest movable land-based object ever built, is not just a feat of engineering. It's a symbol of humanity's determination to confront the consequences of its own hubris. It's strange to think of something so enormous being built for something invisible. The radioactive decay that continues, hidden within the reactor's crumbling ruins. For the thousands of workers who spent years designing and assembling the new safe confinement, it was more than just a job. It was a race against time. The old sarcophagus, hastily built in the aftermath of the explosion, was deteriorating, leaking radioactive dust into the air. There was no choice but to find a solution, one that could contain the reactor for generations to come. The scale of the task was staggering. Over 36,000 tons of steel went into the arch, a structure tall enough to enclose the Statue of Liberty and wide enough to fit an entire football stadium. But this wasn't just about size. It was about precision, safety, and endurance in one of the most hazardous environments on Earth. The human element of the project often gets overshadowed by the grandeur of the structure itself. Workers labored in shifts, knowing every moment spent in proximity to the site carried risks. They donned protective suits, passed through rigorous radiation checks, and operated under the weight of knowing they were working in the shadow of one of history's greatest nuclear disasters. Yet there was a quiet pride among many of them, an understanding that what they were building wasn't just a piece of machinery but a shield for the future. It was a way of saying, we cannot undo what happened here, but we can try to stop it from harming others. Perhaps the most astonishing moment came in 2016, when the massive arch was moved into place. It wasn't constructed over the reactor itself. Radiation levels made that impossible. Instead, it was built 300 meters away and then painstakingly slid into position over the course of several days. Watching it move was surreal, almost otherworldly, as if some giant alien artifact was gliding across the landscape. For those who had worked on the project, it was a moment of triumph, but also of reflection. This was not a victory over the disaster. It was merely a containment of its legacy. Inside the new safe confinement, robotic cranes now dismantle the remains of the reactor's core and its radioactive contents. It's a slow, methodical process that will take decades, even centuries, to complete. And outside, the arch stands silent, a sentinel over the exclusion zone. For the engineers, scientists, and workers who made it possible, there's a quiet acknowledgement that their work may never be fully appreciated by those who come after. The structure isn't a monument in the traditional sense. It doesn't celebrate achievement. Instead, it stands as a reminder of the costs of our mistakes and the lengths we must go to protect future generations from their consequences. The story of the liquidators is one of quiet heroism, desperation, and the painful weight of necessity. They were not a single, unified group, but a patchwork of soldiers, firefighters, engineers, miners, and ordinary workers called upon to face a disaster that no one truly understood at the time. In the days, weeks, and months after the explosion at Chernobyl, over 600,000 people would be conscripted into this unprecedented operation. Some volunteered, moved by duty or the promise of reward. Others were ordered, with little choice but to comply. What united them all was the grim reality that their efforts were essential to prevent an already devastating catastrophe from becoming far worse. The first liquidators on the scene were the firefighters, who raced to Reactor No. For on the night of the explosion, unaware of the invisible enemy they were confronting, armed only with standard fire hoses, they fought the flames that shot into the night sky, fueled by radioactive graphite scattered across the reactor's roof. Within hours, many of them began to collapse, their bodies betraying the first signs of acute radiation sickness. Nausea, burns, and an overwhelming exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. They had no protective gear against radiation, no understanding of what they were breathing in, touching, or standing on. Yet they stayed, trying to quench fires that could have spread the fallout even further. In the days that followed, the task of containing the disaster expanded into something almost surreal in its scope. Soldiers were sent to shovel debris from the reactor's roof, chunks of graphite and other materials so radioactive that standing near them for seconds could deliver a lethal dose. These workers, nicknamed biorobots because machines couldn't handle the radiation, were sent out in brief shifts, sometimes as short as 90 seconds, to fling the material back into the reactor pit. Many of them didn't even know the extent of the danger. They were told it was a national emergency and trusted their superiors, even as they felt their bodies begin to fail. Miners were brought in to dig a tunnel beneath the reactor, a desperate effort to prevent molten nuclear fuel from contaminating groundwater. They worked in suffocating heat and toxic air, often stripped to their underwear because protective suits were impractical in such conditions. They joked darkly among themselves, shared cigarettes during breaks, and pressed on, knowing that their sacrifice was not for themselves, but for millions who might otherwise suffer the fallout. The liquidators weren't just men in uniform. Nurses and doctors worked tirelessly in makeshift hospitals, treating symptoms they had never encountered before, knowing there was little they could do for those exposed to the highest doses. Engineers constructed the first sarcophagus over the ruined reactor, racing against time to seal it before winter, even as radiation seeped through cracks in the structure. Helicopter pilots flew directly over the reactor to drop sand, boron, and lead into the core, fully aware that each pass exposed them to levels of radiation that no human should endure. For many, the aftermath was as cruel as the work itself. Acute radiation sickness claimed the lives of many liquidators in the months after their missions, while countless others developed cancers, heart problems, and other illnesses in the years that followed. Governments often downplayed their suffering, offering little recognition or compensation. Some found solace in the camaraderie they shared, but others were left to grapple with the question of whether their sacrifice had been worth it. Even now, their story is a complicated one, filled with both pride and sorrow. The liquidators didn't save Chernobyl. They couldn't undo the explosion or erase the fallout. But they stopped it from becoming an even greater nightmare. They bought time for the rest of the world, at an unimaginable cost to themselves. Their courage was not the kind of loud, triumphant bravery found in stories of victory. It was quieter, more tragic, the kind of courage that comes from knowing the task ahead is impossible, but doing it anyway, because someone must. Pripyat is a city where life stopped mid-sentence, where time faltered and left everything behind in a strange, eerie stillness. Walking through its streets, you feel the weight of abandonment, the heavy silence that settles in a place meant to be filled with voices, laughter, and ordinary routines. Built in 1970 for the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Pripyat was a city of ambition and promise, a shining example of Soviet modernity. It was young, vibrant, alive, a place where 50,000 people lived, worked, and dreamed. And then, in a matter of hours, it became empty, frozen not in death but in absence. The evacuation came quickly, but not quickly enough. On April 27, 1986, a full day after the reactor exploded, buses lined up to take residents away. They were told it was temporary, a precaution. Bring only essentials, the authorities said. You'll be back in a few days. So people left their belongings. Photographs on walls, books on shelves, laundry drying on balconies. They didn't know they would never return, that their city would become a monument to an unspeakable disaster. Decades later, Pripyat is a ghost town, but one that feels strangely alive in its stillness. The Ferris wheel in the amusement park, meant to open just days after the explosion, stands rusted and unmoving, its yellow cars swaying in the wind. The school's hallways are littered with textbooks, desks overturned as if the children had simply stepped out for recess. Apartment windows gape open, curtains fluttering, revealing rooms that look as though someone might walk back in at any moment. A doll sits on a windowsill in one of these rooms, its face cracked from years of exposure, a silent witness to everything left behind. Nature has reclaimed much of the city now. Trees grow through the floors of buildings, their roots cracking concrete and walls. Ivy wraps itself around lampposts, and wild animals roam streets that once bustled with cars and bicycles. It's hauntingly beautiful in a way that feels wrong, as if nature's quiet resurgence is out of place in a city built for people. The sound of birdsong fills the air where once there was music, laughter, and the hum of everyday life. Yet, even as the forest creeps in, there's an unnaturalness here. The soil, the plants, even the air carry the invisible weight of radiation, a constant reminder of what happened and why no one can come back. For those who once lived there, Pripyat is more than just a collection of abandoned buildings. It's a lost home, a stolen future. Families were scattered, their lives uprooted. Some refused to speak of it for years, unable to bear the pain of what was left behind. Others return as visitors, standing in the shadows of the lives they once knew, pointing to the window of the apartment where they celebrated birthdays, to the park where they played as children. The memories remain vivid even as the city fades, overtaken by rust and decay. Pripyat is not just a relic of the past, it's a warning. It tells the story of a human hubris that believed it could control something as vast and dangerous as nuclear energy, only to find itself undone by a single moment of failure. Yet, it also tells a quieter, more personal story. A story of lives interrupted, of ordinary days turned extraordinary by forces beyond comprehension. Walking through its streets, you don't just see an abandoned city. You feel the echo of what was lost, a city that remains frozen not because it was forgotten, but because it is too painful to fully let go. The radiation at Chernobyl is invisible, silent, and unrelenting. It lingers in the soil, the buildings, the trees, woven into the very fabric of the landscape in ways that defy time and comprehension. Decades have passed since the explosion, and yet, in some areas, it feels as though it happened yesterday. The isotopes left behind, like cesium-137 and strontium-90, decay slowly, their half-lives stretching into hundreds of years. Others, like plutonium-239, will remain a danger for tens of thousands of years, their invisible energy continuing to reshape the environment long after the memories of the disaster have faded from human consciousness. For those who visit the site or work within its bounds, the radiation is both omnipresent and elusive. It doesn't announce itself. There's no glowing light, no smell, no immediate sign of danger. Instead, it's measured in numbers, ticking away on Geiger counters that rise sharply in certain places. The infamous hot spots where contamination remains dangerously high. The Red Forest, just a few kilometers from the reactor, is one such place. Once lush and green, it turned a sickly reddish-brown in the days after the explosion, its trees absorbing lethal doses of radiation. Even now, walking through it is perilous, the ground beneath the canopy holding some of the highest radiation levels in the zone. Visitors are told to avoid touching anything, not to disturb the soil or brush against the plants. The forest has an eerie, unnatural stillness, as though even time is reluctant to move forward here. Closer to the reactor, the dangers become even more concentrated. The melted core of Reactor No. 4, the infamous elephant's foot of solidified nuclear fuel, remains one of the most radioactive objects on Earth. Decades later, the radiation has decreased but not disappeared. It still emits a deadly energy, a grim testament to the immense power unleashed that night in 1986. The structure around it, the new safe confinement, shields the world from this radioactive relic, but even this massive barrier is only a temporary solution. The fuel must be dealt with, a process that will take generations and technology we have yet to fully develop. The radiation doesn't just stay in the places where it's strongest. It travels, in dust particles carried by the wind, in water flowing through rivers and streams, in the very food chain of the animals that now roam the exclusion zone. While some areas have seen radiation levels drop significantly over the years, others remain stubbornly contaminated, a patchwork of danger that defies easy understanding. For the people who once lived here, this uneven contamination feels deeply personal. They've seen homes they can never return to, fields they can never farm, forests where their children once played now declared off-limits for lifetimes. And yet, there's something deeply unsettling about the fact that we can't see the danger. For the scientists and workers who monitor the site, it's a constant reminder of how fragile and limited human perception is. The Geiger counters, the protective suits, the controlled access, they're all attempts to confront something we cannot fully grasp. Radiation doesn't care about borders, time, or human intent. It is indifferent, a force of nature unleashed by human error and bound only by the laws of physics, not morality or consequence. The legacy of radiation at Chernobyl isn't just scientific. It's a human story. It's about the people who left everything behind because of an invisible enemy, and the generations who will grow up knowing parts of the Earth are off-limits because of what happened here. It's about the fragility of our ability to control what we create and the haunting realization that some mistakes cannot simply be erased. The radiation will outlive us, a quiet, enduring reminder of both our power and our fallibility. It persists, shaping the land and the stories we tell about it, long after its original cause has faded from view. Amidst the devastation of Chernobyl, where radiation lingers like an unyielding shadow over the ruined reactor, something unexpected was found. Life, thriving in the unlikeliest of places. Deep inside the reactor's remains, where lethal levels of radiation should have rendered survival impossible, scientists discovered a peculiar black fungus growing on the walls. It wasn't just enduring the radiation. It appeared to be drawn to it, using it in ways no one had thought life could. The discovery was almost surreal, a paradox wrapped in biology. This fungus, later identified as Cryptococcus neoformans and other radiation-loving species, had melanin in its cells, the same pigment found in human skin. But here, melanin seemed to be doing something extraordinary. Just as plants use chlorophyll to capture sunlight and convert it into energy through photosynthesis, this fungus was harnessing radiation in a similar way, a process scientists came to call radiotrophic growth. It wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, transforming the deadly energy of the reactor into a source of life. For the scientists who studied it, this fungus was more than just a biological curiosity. It was a revelation. How could something so simple, so seemingly fragile, adapt to such an extreme environment? The conditions inside the reactor are hostile in every sense of the word. Intense radiation, high temperatures, toxic chemicals. Yet here was this unassuming organism, flourishing where no other life could. It felt almost defiant, as if nature itself was quietly asserting its resilience in the face of humanity's greatest mistakes. There's something deeply humbling about this discovery. While humans built massive sarcophagi and engineered robotic cranes to deal with the fallout, this microscopic fungus found a way to not only exist but to flourish under circumstances we could barely comprehend. It doesn't care about the tragedy of Chernobyl or the scientific marvels of containment. It's simply found a way, reminding us of the adaptability of life in its purest, simplest form. The implications of the fungus go beyond Chernobyl. It's led to questions about life's potential in other extreme environments. On Mars, for instance, where radiation levels are high and conditions harsh. Could something similar exist elsewhere in the universe, turning what we see as obstacles into opportunities? The fungus has also sparked research into how melanin might protect against radiation, potentially offering insights for space exploration or medical treatments. But beyond the science, there's something profoundly symbolic about this strange, radiation-loving fungus. It's a testament to life's tenacity, its ability to persist even in the face of destruction. In the heart of the reactor, where human ingenuity failed so catastrophically, this simple organism found a way to transform disaster into opportunity. It serves as a quiet, persistent reminder that even in the bleakest places, life can endure, adapt, and redefine the rules of survival. The invisible aftermath of Chernobyl etched itself into human bodies in ways that took years to fully reveal. Among the most haunting legacies is the surge in thyroid cancer, a stark reminder of how radiation can ripple through generations. After the explosion, radioactive iodine-131 spilled into the air, carried by winds far beyond the reactor's shattered core. It settled on grass, in water, and on food, entering the bodies of those who unknowingly consumed it. For the human thyroid, this was poison disguised as nourishment. The gland absorbs iodine to produce essential hormones, but in the days and weeks following the disaster, it absorbed something far more dangerous. The victims were often the youngest, children whose growing bodies made them especially vulnerable. Parents had no way of knowing that the milk they gave their children, drawn from cows grazing on contaminated pastures, carried microscopic doses of radiation that would one day twist into malignant growths. In Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Russia, cases of thyroid cancer began to rise sharply within just a few years, a grim anomaly in populations that had previously seen the disease only rarely in young people. For some, it started with a lump in the neck, a persistent cough, or a sense of fatigue that refused to fade. By the time the connection to Chernobyl became clear, thousands were already affected. The rise in thyroid cancer wasn't uniform. It followed the chaotic, unpredictable spread of radioactive fallout. Areas closest to the disaster were hit hardest, but radiation doesn't respect borders. Traces of iodine-131 were found as far away as Sweden and Turkey, though the health effects were most pronounced in regions where people weren't evacuated quickly enough or where information about the contamination was delayed or withheld. In the confusion and secrecy that followed the explosion, basic precautions, such as distributing iodine tablets to saturate the thyroid with safe iodine, were not taken in time. The failure to act left a legacy of preventable suffering. For those diagnosed, the journey hasn't been easy. Some survivors recount their fear during childhood, when they didn't understand why their necks were being examined or why doctors seemed so focused on their thyroids. For many, the diagnosis came with an unsettling mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the cancer was treatable, dread at the knowledge that their bodies had been marked by the disaster in ways they couldn't control. Even now, the effects linger. Studies have shown that the increase in thyroid cancer cases has persisted for decades, with the full extent of the health impacts still unfolding. Entire generations carry the legacy of Chernobyl in their DNA, in their medical records, in their memories of doctors' visits and hospital stays. For those who lived through it, every diagnosis is a reminder of that moment in 1986 when the reactor exploded and invisible particles of radiation began their deadly journey through the air, into the soil, and into their lives. The rise in thyroid cancer tied to Chernobyl is a story of both tragedy and resilience. It's a testament to the lasting harm caused by human error and the slow, painstaking process of confronting its consequences. But it's also a story of survival, of people who have endured, adapted, and carried on despite the scars left by the disaster. It's a sobering reminder that the fallout from Chernobyl wasn't just a matter of contaminated land or abandoned cities. It was a deeply personal catastrophe, written into the bodies of thousands who continue to bear its weight. The explosion at Chernobyl didn't just rupture a reactor. It exposed the fractures within the Soviet Union itself, revealing a system strained by secrecy, inefficiency, and a refusal to acknowledge its own vulnerability. At its core, the Soviet Union thrived on control. Control of information, of its people, of its global image. But Chernobyl was uncontrollable. The disaster unfolded in a way that defied the state's ability to conceal, deny, or spin it. The initial explosion was catastrophic, but the Soviet response, marked by delays, deception, and denial, became a symbol of the regime's deeper failings. In the first hours after the reactor exploded, the instinct wasn't to protect people, but to protect the image of the state. Local authorities downplayed the severity of the disaster, allowing parades and public gatherings to continue even as radioactive particles drifted through the air. It wasn't until radiation alarms went off in Sweden, nearly 1,000 kilometers away, that the world realized something catastrophic had happened. The Soviet Union's attempts to suppress information faltered under the weight of undeniable evidence, and for the first time, its carefully managed facade of competence began to crack on a global stage. Within the Soviet Union, the disaster was a moment of reckoning for many citizens. Chernobyl wasn't just a technical failure. It was a human one, the result of a system that valued obedience over innovation, denial over transparency. When people learned about how the reactor design was flawed, how safety protocols were ignored, and how warnings were dismissed, it fueled a growing distrust in the government. This wasn't just about a power plant in Pripyat. It was about the broader realization that the state could no longer be trusted to safeguard its own people. The cleanup efforts, heroic and tragic as they were, further drained the Soviet economy, already teetering under the weight of its massive military expenditures and inefficient centralized planning. Billions of rubles were poured into containing the disaster, relocating entire communities and decontaminating affected areas. The costs weren't just financial, they were deeply human. The sacrifices of the liquidators, the displacement of hundreds of thousands, and the health crises that followed became a collective burden that the Soviet system was ill-equipped to bear. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader at the time, later admitted that Chernobyl was a turning point. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were, in part, driven by the need to address the systemic flaws that Chernobyl had laid bare. But glasnost, while intended to restore faith, had an unintended consequence. It empowered people to question, to criticize, to demand change. The tightly controlled narrative of the Soviet Union began to unravel as citizens across its vast territories started to see Chernobyl not as an isolated event, but as a symptom of a decaying system. Chernobyl also intensified nationalist movements within the Soviet republics, particularly in Ukraine, where the disaster occurred. For many Ukrainians, Chernobyl became a powerful symbol of Moscow's neglect, rallying point for independence movements that would gain momentum in the years that followed. The radioactive fallout didn't just contaminate the land. It ignited a political fallout that spread far and wide, accelerating the centrifugal forces pulling the Soviet Union apart. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the shadow of Chernobyl was still looming. It wasn't the sole cause of the collapse. There were economic, political, and social forces at play, but it was a catalyst, a moment that crystallized the system's unsustainable contradictions. Chernobyl exposed the weaknesses of a regime that prided itself on strength, the fragility of a system that claimed to be invincible. It was a disaster that resonated far beyond its immediate aftermath, not just as a nuclear catastrophe, but as a pivotal moment in the end of an empire. For the survivors and evacuees of Chernobyl, the greatest scars are often the ones you can't see. The disaster didn't just displace them physically. It uprooted their sense of safety, trust, and belonging in ways that lingered decades later. Many were forced to leave their homes with little warning, told they'd be returning in a few days. They packed lightly, believing the evacuation was temporary, not knowing they would never see their homes again. The suddenness of it all was devastating. One day, they were living ordinary lives, and the next, everything familiar was contaminated, forbidden, left behind. The towns they built, the schools their children attended, the fields they farmed. It all became part of a ghostly no-man's land. The loss of a home wasn't just about losing shelter. It was the loss of a history, a community, and a future. For those who lived in the shadow of the reactor, the fear of radiation became a constant, gnawing presence. The danger wasn't something you could see or feel, which made it all the more insidious. Survivors speak of the paranoia that set in, wondering if the air they breathed or the food they ate was poisoning them. Parents worried endlessly about their children, scrutinizing every cough, every ache, fearing it was the first sign of an illness they didn't fully understand but knew was lurking. The uncertainty was relentless. How much exposure was too much? Was it already too late? For many, the lack of clear answers from authorities only deepened their anxiety, leaving them to grapple with questions they'd never wanted to ask. The stigma attached to being a Chernobyl survivor compounded the psychological toll. In the years following the disaster, evacuees were sometimes treated with suspicion or pity in the communities where they relocated. Some were labeled radiation people, as though they carried contamination with them. Others found themselves isolated by their grief and trauma, unable to explain to those who hadn't been there what it was like to lose everything in an instant. The social strain often added another layer of isolation, making it harder for people to rebuild their lives or feel a sense of normalcy. Children who grew up in the wake of the disaster faced their own unique burdens. Many were haunted by stories of radiation and illness, growing up with a deep, often irrational fear of their own bodies betraying them. For those diagnosed with thyroid cancer or other radiation-linked conditions, the physical pain of treatment was matched by the psychological weight of being told their illness was tied to something they had no control over. Survivors speak of the guilt that lingers, too. The feeling of having escaped while others stayed behind or lost their lives. The mental health impact of Chernobyl didn't fade with time. In some ways, it deepened. Studies have shown higher rates of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder among survivors and evacuees. For many, the act of leaving everything behind, home, family, identity, was akin to a kind of death. The memories of that day, the confusion, the fear, the helicopters spraying chemicals over burning forests, the sight of soldiers in gas masks. These images are etched into their minds, surfacing in nightmares or moments of quiet reflection. And yet, there's resilience too. Among survivors, there's a shared understanding of what was lost, and in some cases, this has fostered a sense of solidarity. Many have found ways to cope, whether through activism, storytelling, or simply by focusing on the lives they've rebuilt. But the pain of Chernobyl never truly disappears. It's a shadow that follows them, shaping the way they see the world and themselves. It's in the hesitation to trust authorities, the urge to keep moving, the quiet but persistent sense that something irrevocable was taken from them that can never be restored. The Chernobyl disaster remains a profound scar on the human story, not just because of its immediate devastation, but because of the uncertainty it left behind. Amid the staggering ruins of Reactor 4, where the explosion spewed radioactive material into the skies, lies a lingering debate about how deeply this catastrophe has etched itself into the lives of those it touched. The official death toll often cited, a starkly low figure compared to the scale of the disaster, feels disconnected from the stories of individuals and families who suffered in ways that statistics cannot capture. The cold numbers fail to account for the aching silences left in homes, the children born with deformities, and the communities slowly hollowed out by cancers and illnesses that scientists still wrestle to definitively tie to Chernobyl. For the people who lived closest to the reactor, the horror didn't end when the fires were extinguished. Villages and towns were emptied overnight, their residents told to pack only what they needed for a short stay away. Many never returned. Entire lifetimes were left behind. Favorite books, family heirlooms, toys still strewn across floors. Those who were evacuated carried the invisible weight of radiation exposure in their bodies, a burden whose effects would unfold over years, manifesting in thyroid cancers, leukemia, and other illnesses. Parents watched helplessly as their children grew sick, while doctors struggled with incomplete information about how to treat diseases they had never encountered on such a scale. And then there are the liquidators, the thousands of men and women sent in to contain the fallout. Clad in rudimentary protective gear, they dug trenches, cleared debris, and built the sarcophagus that would encase the reactor, knowing they were risking their lives to stave off an even greater catastrophe. Many of them paid for their heroism with their health, developing a host of debilitating conditions that robbed them of vitality far too soon. Some lived long enough to tell their stories, but many did not, their names lost to history alongside the truth of what they endured. The long-term health effects remain a source of scientific and political contention. Studies are complex, and the full extent of radiation's impact on human genetics and health may not be understood for generations. This uncertainty is a second tragedy, a fog of doubt and fear that has followed survivors and their descendants. People wonder if the lump in their throat or the shadow on an X-ray is another cruel echo of that fateful night. Families pass down not just genes, but anxieties and whispered warnings about the invisible danger that changed their lives. In the end, the debate over Chernobyl's death toll and health effects isn't just about numbers. It's about acknowledging the human cost, about understanding that behind every statistic is a person who lived, loved, and suffered. The debate is a reminder of how catastrophes ripple through time, their impact measured not just in casualties, but in the generations of people who continue to grapple with their legacies. Chernobyl isn't just a story of a failed reactor. It's a story of resilience, loss, and the haunting questions that remain unanswered. In the abandoned city of Pripyat, the Ferris wheel stands as a silent witness to lives interrupted. It was meant to be a beacon of joy, a centerpiece for the city's May Day celebrations in 1986. Painted bright yellow, its cabins once promised laughter, shared moments, and the wonder of seeing the world from above. But the reactor exploded just days before it was to be unveiled, and the wheel never turned for its intended purpose. Instead, it became something else entirely, a ghostly relic frozen in time, embodying the dreams and innocence of a city that vanished overnight. Walking beneath it now, the silence is palpable. The wheel looms, its structure weathered by decades of exposure, its paint peeling, its metal creaking in the wind. There's a strange intimacy to it, as if the wheel holds within it the echoes of a life that might have been. You can almost imagine the children who would have crowded into its cabins, clutching sticky hands filled with candy, their laughter spilling out over the city square. The parents standing below, pointing upward, their smiles warmed by the sight of their children's delight. All of it feels so close and yet impossibly far away, a reality derailed by catastrophe. For the few who have returned to visit Pripyat, the Ferris wheel often draws them in with a magnetic pull. Some touch its rusted frame, their fingers tracing the remnants of a memory they never had the chance to fully live. Others stand at a distance, unable to approach the weight of its significance. It's not just an abandoned amusement ride. It's a symbol of what was lost, not just for Pripyat, but for everyone caught in the shadow of Chernobyl. The wheel was meant to turn, to mark time with its rotations, but instead it stands still, a poignant reminder of how abruptly life can change. Even now, decades later, the Ferris wheel remains one of the most photographed and haunting symbols of the disaster. But for those who knew Pripyat as a living city, it isn't just an eerie image. It's deeply personal. It's a reminder of the children who never grew up there, the families who never returned, and the futures that never unfolded. The wheel, with its unmoving presence, doesn't just memorialize the past. It poses a question to all who see it. What could have been if only? On an ordinary April morning in 1986, Swedish scientists at the Forsmark nuclear power plant noticed something strange. Radiation alarms began blaring, signaling levels far beyond what anyone expected. At first, there was panic. as workers scrambled to determine if the source was within their own facility. But everything at Forsmark was running smoothly. The realization came slowly, like the unraveling of a dreadful mystery. The radioactive contamination was coming from elsewhere, carried on the winds. It wasn't Sweden's disaster, but something catastrophic had happened. Somewhere. The scientists, stunned and confused, were left to piece together clues from invisible particles, each one a harbinger of a crisis far greater than they could have imagined. That discovery sparked an uneasy tension, the kind that arises when truths are revealed in fragments. The Swedish government, aware of the implications, pressed for answers, their inquiries directed toward the Soviet Union. But there was silence at first. For the Soviets, admitting to an accident of this magnitude wasn't just a matter of international relations. It was an exposure of vulnerability, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of control and technological prowess. Meanwhile, radioactive isotopes drifted over Europe, invisible to the eye but setting off alarms in labs and nuclear plants across the continent. Each new detection painted a picture of an unfolding disaster, its epicenter pinpointed to the area around Chernobyl. For the Swedes, this was no abstract event. The radiation carried real risks to their people, their soil, their air. Scientists and officials worked urgently, trying to calculate exposure levels, to issue warnings, to protect the public. But alongside the technical calculations was a deeply human frustration, a feeling of helplessness as they waited for the truth from a government reluctant to speak it. When the Soviet Union finally admitted to the explosion at Chernobyl, it came not with a sense of closure, but with more questions. How bad was it? How far would the contamination spread? How many lives had already been put at risk in the days of silence? For the people of Sweden and beyond, the revelation that a disaster of such magnitude could go unnoticed, or worse, unacknowledged, by the very nation where it occurred was chilling. It was a reminder of the fragility of safety, the thin veneer of control we believe we have over the forces we unleash. It wasn't just radiation that crossed borders. It was mistrust, fear, and an unsettling awareness of how deeply interconnected we all are, even when walls of secrecy try to divide us. The disaster at Chernobyl was not a sudden, unpredictable act of nature. It was the culmination of human decisions. Some made in ignorance, others under pressure, and a few with outright recklessness. Inside Reactor 4 on that fateful night, a test was underway, meant to determine how the reactor would behave during a power outage. It should have been routine, but the stage had already been set for failure by a series of oversights and flawed procedures. Safety systems were disabled, protocols ignored, and the operators, undertrained and unaware of the full risks, pushed the reactor into an unstable state. They weren't villains. They were people working under the weight of a system that prioritized outcomes over caution, obedience over questioning. As the test progressed, warning signs began to appear. Fluctuations in power, unusual readings. But they were misunderstood or dismissed. Some of the operators hesitated, sensing something was wrong. But the momentum of the task and the hierarchy of command left little room for pause. The reactor, inherently unstable due to design flaws that were poorly communicated to the staff, reached a critical tipping point. A final, fatal combination of actions sent it spiraling out of control. When the explosion came, it shattered not just the reactor's core but the illusion that human ingenuity and authority alone could master such immense power. The tragedy wasn't just the result of a single decision or moment. It was a web of errors stretching back years. Design flaws in the reactor that weren't openly addressed, a culture of secrecy that stifled criticism, and a system that left operators without the tools or knowledge to safely manage what they were entrusted with. These weren't faceless errors. They were made by engineers, managers, and policymakers, people who likely believed they were doing their best under the circumstances. Some may have been overly confident in their knowledge. Others, too fearful of the consequences of questioning orders. What makes it so haunting is how human it all was. The mistakes weren't made out of malice, but out of the same mix of ambition, complacency, and fallibility that defines so much of human endeavor. In the end, the disaster wasn't just a failure of technology. It was a failure to respect its limits and to recognize the weight of responsibility that comes with wielding such power. Chernobyl wasn't inevitable, but it serves as a stark reminder of what happens when the human element, so vital and so flawed, is underestimated in matters of such immense consequence. The Chernobyl disaster was a moment of reckoning for the world, an event so catastrophic that it forced nations to confront the fallibility of their nuclear ambitions. In the days and months following the explosion, as radioactive plumes spread across borders and the horrifying details emerged, it became clear that this was not just a Soviet problem. The disaster transcended politics and ideology, exposing the shared responsibility of all nations to ensure that such a tragedy could never happen again. In the immediate aftermath, governments and organizations around the world began re-examining their own nuclear programs. Inspectors returned to plants, checking every system, every protocol, every contingency plan. Engineers pored over designs, searching for weaknesses that could lead to similar failures. What had once been thought of as unshakable, nuclear reactors operating under the strictest standards of safety, was now viewed through a lens of doubt and scrutiny. The haunting images from Chernobyl and the growing list of health and environmental consequences served as a stark reminder that even the smallest oversight could have catastrophic consequences. But it wasn't just about technical fixes. Chernobyl highlighted the deeper, systemic flaws that had allowed the disaster to occur: a lack of transparency, insufficient training, and a culture that discouraged questioning authority. These lessons resonated far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. International organizations, like the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, took on a new urgency in promoting cooperation and setting standards. Countries began sharing information more openly, creating networks to ensure that best practices in safety were not confined by borders. Training programs were overhauled, making sure operators were equipped not just with technical skills, but with the authority to act decisively in emergencies, even if it meant overriding orders. For many, the reforms came with a personal weight. Nuclear workers, scientists, and policymakers were acutely aware that they were now responsible for preventing another disaster. Some had spent their careers advocating for the promise of nuclear energy, believing in its potential to provide clean and abundant power. After Chernobyl, their work carried a new gravity as they wrestled with the knowledge of what could go wrong. The reforms weren't just about rules and regulations. They were about restoring trust, both in the technology and in the people who managed it. Over time, the changes began to take root. Designs evolved, incorporating passive safety systems that could operate even without human intervention. Emergency preparedness plans became more robust, with drills simulating worst-case scenarios. Public engagement grew, as communities demanded more accountability and transparency from the nuclear industry. Yet, for all the progress, Chernobyl remains a shadow over every reactor, a constant reminder of the cost of complacency. It didn't just reshape the technical and regulatory landscape. It reshaped how humanity viewed its relationship with this immense and volatile power. The reforms were necessary, but they were also a testament to the human ability to learn from tragedy, a somber, enduring legacy of the lives and landscapes lost. As we reach the end of this journey through the haunting tale of Chernobyl, it's hard not to feel the weight of the stories we've uncovered. Of ambition turned tragedy, of silence broken by courage, and of the strange resilience of both nature and humanity. Thank you for staying with us as we piece together the fragments of this nuclear ghost story. From the historical context to the lingering legacy, the story of Chernobyl is a stark reminder of the delicate balance between progress and peril. If you found this journey through the shadows of history compelling, why not light up the comments with your thoughts? And if you want to explore more quiet corners of the universe, where mystery and wonder collide, be sure to subscribe to Quiet Universe. Hit that like button. It's not radioactive, I promise. And share this with anyone who's ready to dive into stories that linger long after the screen goes dark. Until next time, keep your curiosity glowing, and I'll see you in the next story.